Deep in the limestone cliffs of a valley in Upper Egypt, there is a tomb that was never finished. It stretches more than 100 meters into the mountain, corridor after corridor, chamber after chamber, cut by hands that worked for decades before simply stopping. The walls in the innermost chambers are bare, no paintings, no inscriptions, no gilded animals standing watch over the dead king's passage into eternity. No portraits of him making offerings to Osiris or sailing the golden solar boat across the underworld. Just raw stone and the pale ghost marks of the chisels that cut it, and a silence that has lasted roughly 3,000 years. This is KV4, the fourth tomb catalogued in the Valley of the Kings, and it belongs to a pharaoh named Ramesses XI. Most visitors to the Valley of the Kings walk past this tomb without stopping. They are heading for KV62, the golden chambers of Tutankhamun, crammed with 3,000 years of treasure that made the world hold its breath when Howard Carter first lifted his candlelight into the antechamber in 1922. Or they head for KV17, the deep-painted corridors of Seti I, which many Egyptologists consider the most visually magnificent tomb in the entire necropolis, its astronomical ceiling and its finely cut reliefs still vivid after 3,200 years. KV4 sits between the famous tombs, its entrance open, its interior dark, its walls silent. A placard marks it. Tourists look in and move on. And in that small, unremarkable fact, in that casual passing over, there is an entire story about how civilizations die. Ramesses XI ruled Egypt for approximately 27 to 30 years. His exact dates remain debated by scholars, which is itself a symptom of how completely the historical record unraveled around him. He was the 10th and final king of the 20th Dynasty. He was the last pharaoh of the period historians call the New Kingdom. And when he died, sometime around 1077 BCE according to current estimates, he did not simply pass a throne to a successor. He ended an era that had lasted nearly 500 years, an era that had produced the colossi of Abu Simbel, the Ramesseum, the great hypostyle hall at Karnak, and more monumental stonework than any other civilization on Earth would build for another 2,000 years. After Ramesses XI, Egypt would never again be what it had been. The empire was gone, the gold reserves were exhausted, the priests had assumed political control of the south. The army had fragmented along lines of ethnicity and loyalty. The working people were hungry. And the pharaoh, that living god, that son of Ra, that axis around which all Egyptian civilization turned, had become, in the words of his own era's surviving documents, largely irrelevant to the actual governance of the country he nominally ruled. Let that sink in. The civilization that had organized and mobilized tens of thousands of workers to build the Great Pyramid, the civilization that had maintained an unbroken written cultural tradition for over 2,000 years before Ramesses XI was born, the civilization that had sent trading expeditions to the land of Punt on the Horn of Africa, that had established diplomatic correspondence with kings in Babylon and Assyria, and the Aegean, that had produced what is recognized as the first peace treaty in recorded human history. This civilization did not fall to a conquering army. It did not burn in a single catastrophic night. It hollowed out from within, slowly, over generations. The power drained away from the palace and pooled in the temples, the garrison towns, and the hands of men who were not pharaohs, but who, by the end, were indistinguishable from them in every way that mattered. The story of Ramesses XI is not the story of a single man's failure. It is the story of an ending that had been building for nearly a century before he was ever born. It is the story of famines and civil wars and tomb robbers breaking into the graves of divine kings and a military priest who carved his own name in the royal pose on temple walls, while the actual pharaoh sat, effectively powerless, in a palace far to the north. It is the story of the world's most durable civilization, encountering at last the limit of what institutional momentum alone could sustain. And it is the story of an unfinished tomb, of a king who could not complete the house of his eternal rest, because the country that had built temples and tombs for 3 millennia simply did not have enough left to finish one more. The craftsmen were gone, or unpaid, or redirected. The gold that should have covered the walls was not arriving from the depleted Nubian mines. The painters, who should have filled those chambers with colour and prayer and the names of the gods of the underworld were absent. The institution that had built the most magnificent funerary monuments on earth, without interruption, for 500 years, found itself unable to complete the burial of its own last king. That is the image to hold. Not a battlefield, not a burning city, an unfinished tomb, the bare walls in the dark, the chisel marks where the work stopped, the silence where there should have been gold. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand not just who Ramesses XI was, but why his story matters. Why the collapse of the Egyptian New Kingdom is one of the most instructive, haunting, and strangely contemporary case studies in the entire human past. Why the patterns that unmade that civilization are not unique to ancient Egypt, not confined to the distant world of hieroglyphs and desert sand. Why, standing in that bare-walled, unfinished tomb in the cliffs outside Luxor, looking at the chisel marks on the raw limestone, you are not standing in front of ancient history. You are standing in front of a mirror. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now, let us begin. To understand what was lost when the New Kingdom ended, you have to understand what it was at its beginning, not as an entry in a history textbook, not as a succession of dynasty numbers and pharaonic names that blur together after the third repetition, but as a story. A story that begins with a young king, a wounded country, and a decision that would shape the ancient world for 5 centuries. His name was Ahmose I. He was perhaps 17 years old when he came to the throne of a fractured and humiliated Egypt sometime around 1550 BCE according to current estimates, and the Egypt he inherited was a country defined by a wound. For more than a century before Ahmose was born, the northern part of Egypt, the broad, fertile delta where the Nile spreads toward the Mediterranean, had been partially occupied by a foreign power. The Egyptians called these occupiers the Hyksos, a word that translates roughly to rulers of foreign lands. They had come from the northeast, from somewhere in the broad arc of Canaan and the Levant, and they had brought with them military technologies that Egypt had never encountered and was completely unprepared to face. The horse-drawn chariot, the composite bow of laminated horn and sinew, bronze weapons and armor that outperformed anything the Egyptians were fielding. The Hyksos established their own dynasty in the delta city of Avaris and reduced the Egyptian rulers of the south to something between tributaries and irrelevance, paying gold and grain to a foreign king in the land of the gods. This occupation became the foundational trauma of the New Kingdom. Every pharaoh who followed Ahmose I was shaped, in ways both explicit and structural, by the memory of what it felt like to be conquered. That memory drove the military expansion, the obsession with buffer zones in Canaan and Nubia, the relentless investment in military technology, and the determination to ensure that no rival power could ever again grow strong enough to threaten Egyptian sovereignty. The Hyksos taught Egypt how to be an empire, and Egypt never forgot the lesson. Ahmose I expelled the Hyksos, reunited the country, campaigned in Nubia to restore Egyptian control over the gold-rich lands to the south, and established a state qualitatively different from what had existed before. Militarized, expansionist, capable of sustained projection of power far beyond its borders, the New Kingdom that grew from his campaigns would spend the next 2 centuries building on that foundation, until it became the dominant superpower of the ancient Near East. The pharaohs who followed Ahmose built with extraordinary energy and vision. Amenhotep I and Thutmose I pushed Egyptian campaigns deeper into Nubia and further into the Levant than Egyptian armies had ever gone. Thutmose I reached the Euphrates River, sending back reports of a great river that flowed backwards, meaning it flowed south to north rather than north to south like the Nile, and his soldiers, who had never seen such a thing, did not know how to describe it. Then came Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut is one of the most remarkable figures of the ancient world, and she deserves more than a single line in the larger story of the New Kingdom. She was the daughter of Thutmose I and the principal wife of Thutmose II. When Thutmose II died, the throne passed to his son by a secondary wife, a boy still too young to rule alone. Hatshepsut served as regent, and then she did something unprecedented. She declared herself not regent, not queen, not co-ruler, but pharaoh. She assumed the full royal titulary. She was depicted in her statues and temple reliefs in the traditional masculine royal pose, wearing the double crown and the ritual false beard of kingship. She ruled for approximately 20 years, and she ruled magnificently. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri, on the west bank of Luxor, remains one of the architectural masterpieces of the ancient world. 3 colonnaded terraces rise against a sheer limestone cliff, connected by ramps, the whole structure integrating so organically with the natural amphitheatre of the mountain behind it that it is difficult to say where the human architecture ends and the natural landscape begins. Inside, the reliefs that cover its walls are among the most detailed and vivid in all of New Kingdom art. Scenes of the divine birth of Hatshepsut herself, scenes of religious festivals, and the famous reliefs recording her expedition to Punt, Egyptian ships sailing the Red Sea, a tropical land where the houses stand on stilts. The Queen of Punt, depicted with unusual specificity by the Egyptian artists, suggesting they were drawing from life rather than convention. Ships being loaded with living mere trees, their roots packed in baskets of soil for the journey, alongside ebony and ivory and gold and incense and baboons and exotic dogs. Hatshepsut brought the wonders of a distant world to Thebes and inscribed the record of their arrival in permanent stone. Her stepson Thutmose III, who had waited decades for sole rule, finally came into his full power after her death. He is often called the Napoleon of ancient Egypt, and the comparison, for once in ancient history writing, is not rhetorical excess. He launched 17 campaigns in the Levant over the course of his reign, extending Egyptian control from the fourth cataract of the Nile, deep in Nubia, to the upper Euphrates in Syria. His first campaign, against a Canaanite coalition assembled at Megiddo, is documented in the annals of Thutmose III, inscribed on the walls of Karnak, and studied by military historians as a masterclass in bold tactical decision-making. Faced with 3 possible routes to the battlefield, he took the most dangerous one. A narrow mountain pass his generals had counselled against emerged where the enemy least expected him and shattered the coalition before it could regroup. The siege of Megiddo that followed lasted 7 months. The city fell. The wealth that flowed into Egypt from Thutmose III's empire was enormous. Tribute from the Levantine city-states, gold from the Nubian mines, copper from Sinai and Cyprus, cedar wood from Lebanon, lapis lazuli traded across the entire width of the ancient world. The new kingdom was becoming one of the great economic engines of antiquity, a redistribution machine that gathered wealth from its peripheries and concentrated it at its center in the temples and palaces and storehouses of Thebes. Amenhotep III, Thutmose III's great-great-grandson, inherited this machine at the height of its efficiency and ran it without military campaigns for nearly 40 years. He conducted foreign policy through the exchange of diplomatic letters and strategic marriages, and the archive of his correspondence, the Amarna letters discovered in the Egyptian desert in the 1880s, preserves this international world with remarkable intimacy. Kings addressed Amenhotep III as brother. They wrote to him asking for gold and horses and his daughters in marriage. He sent gold, he sent horses, he sometimes sent daughters, though he was notably reluctant to send his own Egyptian princesses abroad, on the grounds that daughters of Egypt did not marry foreign kings, a principle he maintained while happily accumulating foreign princesses in his own household. He wrote to the king of Babylon that gold in Egypt was like dust. At his death, the new kingdom had never been richer, never been more internationally connected, never been more physically monumental. Luxor Temple was largely his creation. The 2 colossal seated statues that still stand alone in the fields of the West Bank, known as the Colossi of Memnon, were the gatekeepers of his own mortuary temple, now mostly destroyed. He was building at a scale that made the monuments of his predecessors look modest. His son destroyed all of it in less than 2 decades. Akhenaten, who came to the throne around 1353 BCE initially as Amenhotep IV, abolished the traditional Egyptian pantheon, ordered the closure of the temples of all gods except the solar disk Aten, redirected the enormous accumulated wealth of the Amun priesthood to his new solar religion, abandoned Thebes, and built an entirely new capital city in the desert, called Akhenaten, today Tel El Amarna, specifically chosen because it was virgin ground, uncontaminated by the presence of any other god. He moved the court, the administrative apparatus, the diplomatic corps, everything, to this new city in the cliffs. The foreign policy consequences were immediate and severe. The Amarna letters from Akhenaten's later reign are full of desperate pleas from Egyptian vassal rulers in Canaan. They are being attacked, their cities are falling, they are asking for Egyptian troops and receiving nothing. A prince named Ribhadar of Byblos wrote to the pharaoh repeatedly over years, watching his city shrink, his allies fall away, his situation become critical, begging for help. The help never came. Egypt's influence in the Levant, carefully built over more than a century of military campaigns and diplomatic investment, was evaporating while the pharaoh held religious festivals in a desert city. Akhenaten died around 1336 BCE. The reversal was immediate. His successors, including the boy king Tutankhamun, restored the temples and the traditional gods. The priesthood of Amun, which had been stripped of its wealth and position, was reinstated and compensated. Akhenaten was abandoned to the desert. In the decades that followed, Akhenaten's name was systematically erased from monuments across Egypt, his statues smashed, his images defaced. He became, in the official record, the pharaoh who had never existed. But the Amun priesthood that was restored after his death was not quite what it had been before. It had experienced the fragility of its position. It had survived persecution. It had learned that its power was not automatically guaranteed by the existence of a sympathetic pharaoh. And it had learned, consequently, what it needed to do to protect itself when that sympathy was withdrawn. Accumulate land, accumulate income, accumulate institutional independence, sufficient to survive even a hostile reign. The compensatory gifts of land and tax exemption granted by the post-Amarna pharaohs accelerated a process that had been underway for generations. The Amun temple grew richer, its land holdings grew larger, its institutional autonomy grew deeper, and the high priest of Amun sat at the top of all of this, managing estates that generated more agricultural income than many provincial governors. Into this environment stepped Ramesses II, who came to the throne around 1279 BCE and ruled for 67 years. He is one of the most relentlessly present figures in all of ancient Egyptian history. His image appears on more monuments, in more locations, in more contexts than any other pharaoh. Abu Simbel, with its 420-meter colossi and its sun-aligned inner sanctuary, is his most famous monument, but it is one item in an inventory so vast that entire scholarly careers have been spent simply cataloguing its contents. The great hypostyle hall at Karnak, with its 134 columns, some of them 21 meters tall and wide enough that 6 people cannot reach around them, was substantially completed under his reign. The Ramesseum, his mortuary temple on the west bank of Luxor, once contained the largest single piece of sculpture ever cut from an Egyptian quarry. A massive seated colossus of the king himself, made from a single block of red granite, estimated to have weighed approximately 1,000 tons when complete. It fell, and its shattered fragments still lie in the sand of the Ramesseum courtyard, where Shelley's poem Ozymandias found its inspiration 2,000 years after the Colossus toppled. Ramesses II fought the Battle of Kadesh in year 5 of his reign, approximately 1274 BCE, against the Hittite king Muwatalli II. The battle was a near disaster that he personally survived through extraordinary courage or extraordinary luck, depending on how much weight you give to the Egyptian propaganda account versus the more measured military record. He fought his way out of an ambush. By nightfall, neither side had won decisively. Ramesses II went home to Egypt and inscribed the battle as an overwhelming triumph on the walls of every major temple in the country. He was not precisely lying. He had survived. He had not been defeated, but the inscriptions in which he personally slaughters entire armies of Hittites with divine assistance, the reliefs in which the enemies flee in chaos before his single chariot, these belong to the genre of royal self-presentation, not to the genre of military history. What was historically real was the peace treaty that followed 15 years later, in 1259 BCE. Ramesses II and Hattusili III, the Hittite king who had succeeded Muwatalli, negotiated an agreement on silver tablets that both sides then inscribed on their own monuments. The tablets established mutual recognition, a defined border, extradition of fugitives, and mutual defense obligations. It was the first surviving peace treaty in recorded human history, and a copy of it today hangs on the wall of the United Nations headquarters in New York. Ramesses II died more than 3,000 years before that copy was installed, and his words were still shaping the world's institutional understanding of itself. This is the civilization whose last chapter Ramesses XI would write, and the seeds of that chapter were planted, paradoxically, by the new kingdom's greatest triumphs. Every estate gifted to Amun was a transfer of resources from the pharaoh to the priesthood. Every generation of generous kings strengthened the institution that would ultimately absorb the throne's authority. The math was always working against the palace. No single king made a fatal error. The fatal error was structural, embedded in the architecture of the new kingdom itself, and it took nearly 500 years to fully manifest. After Ramesses II died, the succession passed through increasingly shorter and less consequential reigns. Meremptah, his 13th son and already elderly at accession, fought off a combined Libyan and Sea People invasion and won day, leaving the famous Meremptah stele with its earliest reference to the name Israel. After Meremptah came dynastic instability, a disputed succession, briefly a woman named Twosret as pharaoh, then the founding of the 20th Dynasty by Setnakhe. Setnakhe's son Ramesses III was the last genuinely powerful Egyptian king, defeating the Sea Peoples in 2 famous battles and leaving the extraordinary reliefs of Medinet Habu. After him, 8 more kings in roughly 80 years, each reign shorter and more obscure than the last. The average reign of the Ramessids after Ramesses III was approximately 10 years. Ramesses II had held the throne for 67. The contrast measures something real. Not just the brevity of individual reigns, but the inability of any one pharaoh to build the long-term institutional relationships, the accumulated personal authority, the generational loyalty that sustained genuine imperial power. While the dynastic situation deteriorated, the Amun temple continued to grow. While the pharaohs cycled through the throne in shortening intervals, the priestly families of Karnak accumulated land and authority across generations. The power equation was shifting, and somewhere in the limestone cliffs above the Valley of the Kings, a tomb was being cut, corridor by corridor, for the pharaoh who would be the last. The physical evidence of the new kingdom's achievements is worth dwelling on, because numbers alone cannot convey the scale of what was built. The great hypostyle hall at Karnak, begun under Seti I and largely completed by Ramesses II, covers an area of approximately 5,300 square meters. It contains 134 columns in 16 rows, the central 2 rows of which are each roughly 21 meters tall, wider at the top than a person is tall, with capitals in the form of open papyrus flowers. When the hall was roofed in antiquity, and the interior was lit by the slanted light falling through the stone clerestory windows above the central corridor, the effect of standing in that forest of enormous columns, with painted reliefs covering every surface, with incense smoke drifting through the coloured light, with the sounds of ritual chanting echoing off the stone, must have been overwhelming. It was designed to be overwhelming. It was designed to communicate, at the scale of geology, the power and permanence of the divine order that the pharaoh embodied and sustained. The Valley of the Kings, used for royal burials from approximately the reign of Thutmose I around 1500 BCE to the end of the 20th Dynasty, under Ramesses XI, contains 63 known tombs and tomb pits. Some of them, like KV-17, the tomb of Seti I, extend nearly 130 meters into the limestone, descending through multiple corridors and chambers to a burial hall, with an astronomical ceiling and walls painted with the full program of the royal funerary texts. The Amduat, the Book of Gates, the Litany of Ra, guides for the dead king's journey through the 12 hours of the night from sunset to sunrise. These tombs were not merely repositories for the royal body, they were machines for ensuring the king's successful navigation of the afterlife. constructed and decorated according to precise theological specifications, maintained and guarded, because the king's continued existence in the next world was understood to be cosmologically necessary for the continued functioning of this one. If the pharaoh failed to reach his divine destination, the sun would not rise, the Nile would not flood, the crops would not grow. The royal tomb was not a luxury or a vanity, it was essential infrastructure. This is the context in which the tomb robberies of the late 20th Dynasty must be understood. When the workers of Deir el-Medina broke into the tombs of the earlier pharaohs and stripped the gold from their mummies and burned their coffins, they were not merely committing property crimes. By the logic of the civilization in which they lived, they were sabotaging the machinery that kept the world running. And they did it anyway, which tells you how desperate they were, and how completely the state had failed to sustain the obligations it owed to the people who sustained it. The 18th dynasty pharaohs who built the Valley of the Kings had, in their lifetimes, been served by an institution that worked. The grain came, the copper came, the wood came, the linen came, the medical treatment came. The legal system functioned well enough to resolve disputes without recourse to private violence. The chain of obligation that ran from the pharaoh through the vizier, through the regional administrators, down to the village foreman, and into the households of the craftsmen was intact. Not perfect. There were strikes and complaints and corruption and favoritism throughout the New Kingdom's history, but the fundamental exchange held. The workers built and maintained the monuments of the divine order, and the state fed and clothed and sheltered them in return. When that chain broke, it did not break all at once. It frayed, link by link, across generations. The ration deliveries became slower, then more intermittent. The tool replacements became less reliable. The special provisions for feast days, the fish and the wine and the cakes that mark the religious calendar and provide moments of abundance in an otherwise modest diet, these became rarer. Each individual failure was manageable. Each could be explained by a temporary shortage, a disruption in supply routes, an administrative delay. But over decades, the accumulation of small failures taught the community of Deir el-Medina something that no official proclamation could undo. The state was not reliable. The state might not be there when you needed it. And if the state was not reliable, then the obligations the state enforced, including the absolute prohibition against robbing the royal dead, were not backed by a credible threat of consequences. The Egyptologist John Romer, who spent years working in the Valley of the Kings and wrote one of the most vivid accounts of the tomb robbery crisis in his book, The Valley of the Kings, described the situation with characteristic precision. The Great Conspiracy was not organized crime. It was the spontaneous self-rescue of a community that had been abandoned. That observation cuts to the heart of the matter. The robbers were not alien criminals who had invaded a functioning society from outside. They were members of the community that society had created for the specific purpose of protecting the royal dead. Their robbery was, in the most direct and concrete sense, a consequence of the state's prior failure to fulfill its own obligations. This understanding reframes the entire story of the late New Kingdom's collapse. It was not primarily a story of exceptional wickedness or extraordinary individual failure. It was a story about what happens when a complex institutional system, maintained by an unspoken but real set of mutual obligations, stops meeting those obligations. The corrosion does not begin with the most dramatic events. It begins with the 18th day without rations, with the copper chisel that is not replaced, with the letter to the vizier's office that receives an evasive reply, with the official who covers up a robbery because the alternative is acknowledging that the system he is supposed to operate has broken down. Each small failure enables the next. Each compromise of the institutional order makes the next compromise more thinkable. And by the time the hyenas are in the streets of Thebes, it is not one failure you are looking at. It is the accumulated consequence of 100 earlier ones. The assassination of Ramesses III changed everything. In the 32nd year of his reign, sometime around 1153 BCE, Ramesses III was murdered. The conspiracy was organized by a secondary wife named Ta, who wanted her son Pentar on the throne, instead of the designated crown prince. The network of conspirators extended deep into the royal household. Harem servants, court officials, military officers, women who worked in the harem quarters and could observe the king's movements, a treasury official whose access to materials was needed for the plan, a general named Pies who commanded troops. The conspiracy was sophisticated and specific. It had a clear objective, a coordinated execution, and enough participants that its discovery, when it came, revealed the degree to which the pharaoh's inner circle had been compromised. The murder succeeded. The crown prince survived and became Ramesses IV. The trial that followed was documented in the judicial papyrus of Turin, now in Turin's Museo Egizio, which records the proceedings with the flat precision of a bureaucratic document trying very hard to contain something that is, underneath the formal language, a catastrophe. The accused were divided into categories of culpability. Some were condemned to have their noses and ears cut off. Others were forced to take their own lives in the courtroom. The papyrus records this with the same tone it uses to record property transfers. Pentuer, the would-be king, was allowed to die by his own hand, a courtesy extended to men of royal blood that the court could not quite deny even to a traitor and a killer. For decades, scholars debated whether Ramesses III had actually died in the conspiracy or survived to see its suppression. The mummy of Ramesses III had been rewrapped and relocated in antiquity, its condition making direct examination difficult. The question was resolved in 2012 when a team using CT scanning technology examined the mummy and found a wound beneath the bandages, a deep cut across the front of the throat, extending to the vertebrae of the spine. The pharaoh had been killed with a straight-bladed instrument driven forward from the front. Someone had stood before the living god, the son of Ra, the divine intermediary between earth and heaven, and cut his throat. Let that sink in, not as a detail of ancient criminology, but as a structural fact about the world that the new kingdom's remaining pharaohs would have to inhabit. The invulnerability of the king, the divine protection that surrounded him, the cosmic distance between the pharaoh and ordinary human mortality, this was not a theological abstraction in Egyptian civilization. It was the foundation of the entire political and religious order. Every ritual, every inscription, every ceremonial act reinforced it. The pharaoh was divine. The pharaoh was protected. The pharaoh was not like ordinary people, could not be touched by ordinary violence. And then a knife was driven into the throat of Ramesses III, and that foundational claim was permanently weakened, not destroyed. The new kingdom continued for another 80 years, but the crack was there, and every subsequent crisis would run along it. After Ramesses III, the 20th Dynasty produced 8 more kings in roughly 80 years. Ramesses IV through Ramesses XI, each inheriting a slightly smaller, slightly more troubled country. The reigns were short and growing shorter. Ramesses IV about 6 years, Ramesses about 4, Ramesses VI about 7. The later ones, Ramesses VII through X, ruled in conditions of increasing documentary obscurity, their courts generating fewer monuments, their administrative records more fragmentary, their political authority harder to trace in the surviving evidence. The thinning of the documentary record is itself significant. The New Kingdom state had been one of the most administratively intensive entities in the ancient world. The pharaohs of the 18th dynasty and the early 19th had generated enormous quantities of official records, tribute lists, census data, temple construction accounts, diplomatic correspondence, legal proceedings, medical papyri, astronomical texts. When this record thins out in the later 20th dynasty, it tells us that the administrative apparatus has thinned out with it. A government that has stopped recording its own activities has, in some important institutional sense, stopped trusting itself to last. The most vivid documentary window into the late 20th dynasty comes not from the official records of any pharaoh's court, but from the workers' village at Deir el-Medina. This was the community of professional craftsmen who built and maintained the Valley of the Kings, a village of perhaps 60 or 70 households at its height, home to the stonecutters, painters, sculptors and scribes whose work produced the royal tombs. They were among the most privileged workers in Egypt, better paid, better housed, more literate than virtually any comparable community in the ancient world. their administrative records, their personal letters, their legal documents, their shopping lists, their love poems, their dream interpretations, their medical prescriptions. All of this survives in extraordinary quantity in the ostraca and papyri that the dry desert air of the Luxor West Bank has preserved for 3,000 years. And what those records show in the later 20th Dynasty is a community under mounting, chronic, relentless pressure. In year 29 of Ramesses III's reign, the work gang staged what is widely recognized as the first recorded labor strike in human history. They left their tools, crossed the ridge that separated their village from the mortuary temple zone, and sat down outside the temples of Thutmose III and Seti I, refusing to move. Their grain rations had not arrived for 18 days. The formal statement they made to the officials who came to deal with them, preserved in one of the Deir el-Medina ostraca, is precise and without drama. We have been driven here by hunger and thirst. There is no clothing, there is no ointment, there is no fish, there is no vegetable. Write to the Pharaoh our good lord, and write to the vizier our superior, so that sustenance may be given to us. After some negotiation, emergency provisions were delivered. The workers returned. This is the first labour strike in recorded human history. Understand what it tells us. These were the most carefully maintained, most highly privileged workers in the Egyptian state. If they were going hungry, and if their situation was severe enough to require public collective action that broke every convention of Egyptian social hierarchy, the state's logistical systems were not merely under strain. They were failing at their most carefully tended edges. By the reign of Ramesses IX, roughly 40 years after that first strike, the administrative correspondence from Deir el-Medina documents what had become chronic failure. Grain deliveries were arriving months late or not at all. Fish deliveries, a staple protein for the community's families, were irregular. Copper chisels, the basic tools of tomb cutting, were not being replaced when they wore out. In a series of letters preserved in the British Museum, the foreman of the work gang writes to the vizier's office with increasing urgency about workers who have been sitting idle for weeks for lack of functioning tools. The replies, when they come, are evasive. The tone of both sides of the correspondence carries the specific exhaustion of people who know the problem is real, know the system currently cannot solve it, and have no choice but to continue writing formally while privately understanding that nothing is going to change. Into this context of institutional failure, the tomb robberies began. Or more precisely, they began to be formally acknowledged. They had almost certainly been happening earlier. The Valley of the Kings had been Egypt's sacred necropolis since the reign of Thutmose I, more than 400 years before Ramesses IX. Its security rested on multiple pillars: dedicated Medjay police, the physical inaccessibility of rock-cut tombs sealed with stone and mortar, and the overwhelming social and religious taboo against disturbing the burial of a divine king. The tombs contained the mummified bodies of gods. To rob them was not theft in the ordinary sense. It was an assault on the cosmic order. It was the most extreme sacrilege imaginable in Egyptian religious thought. And yet, by the reign of Ramesses IX, systematic robbery was underway. The documentation of this crisis is preserved in a group of papyri known as the Tomb Robbery Papyri, scattered across several European museums: the Abbott Papyrus in the British Museum, the Amherst Papyrus in the Morgan Library in New York, the Mayer A and Mayer B papyri in the Liverpool World Museum, and several related documents. Together these constitute one of the most detailed criminal archives from the ancient world. They record a formal inspection of the Theban royal necropolis in approximately year 16 of Ramesses IX, around 1111 BCE according to current estimates, and the legal proceedings that followed. The inspection found that the majority of the tombs examined had been entered, not a few. The majority. Some had been breached multiple times. The gold had been stripped from the mummies. The furniture had been removed. In some cases, the mummy wrappings had been set on fire to access the jewellery and amulets placed directly against the skin of the royal body. One confession has survived in particular completeness. A stonecutter named Amenhotep described breaking into the tomb of a 17th dynasty pharaoh named Sekhemre-Shedwaset, together with 7 colleagues. His account of what they found and what they did carries a weight that time has not diminished. We opened their sarcophagi and their coffins and found the noble mummy of this king. There was a large number of amulets and jewels of gold at his throat, and his head covering was of gold. The noble mummy of the king was entirely overlaid with gold, and his coffins were decorated with gold and silver within and without, and inlaid with precious stones. We stripped off the gold which we found on the mummy, as well as the amulets and jewels around his neck. We set fire to their coffins. The 8 men divided the proceeds. Each received 20 devon of gold, roughly 1.8 kilograms, equivalent to approximately 18 months of ordinary craftsman wages. They had made a year and a half's earnings in a single night, and they had done it by burning a pharaoh. That last detail, so casually recorded, tells you something crucial. The burning of the coffins was not vandalism or cruelty, it was efficiency. The coffins were overlaid with gold leaf and inlaid with precious materials in a structure that made selective removal time-consuming. Fire was faster. The mummy inside represented one of the gods of Egypt, the sacred preserved body that had been prepared with elaborate ritual care to sustain the king's spirit across eternity. The robbers burned it with the same practical detachment with which a modern thief might toss packaging material aside. The theology of sacred kingship, the most fundamental claim of Egyptian civilization, the premise on which everything else rested, had become, for these men in the dark with their tools, an inconvenience. The investigation that followed revealed something even more disturbing than the robberies themselves. It was being obstructed. The mayor of Western Thebes, a man named Pharaoh, whose jurisdiction included the Valley of the Kings, and who was therefore personally responsible for its security, used political connections to discredit the official who had raised the alarm, a man named Pesa, the mayor of Eastern Thebes, and to limit the scope of the prosecutions. Some robbers were convicted, some were punished, but additional robbery papyri from the reigns of Ramesses X and XI indicate that the looting continued. The institution of the Valley of the Kings was being dismantled from within, by people who knew exactly what they were doing, aided by officials who knew exactly what was happening and chose not to stop it, and it gets worse. Some of those robbers were not outsiders who had stumbled onto the valley's secrets. Some of them were the craftsmen of Deir el-Medina, the men who had built the tombs. They knew the Valley of the Kings more intimately than any other living people. They knew which pharaohs were buried where, the layout of each tomb's corridors, the location of each burial chamber, which kings had been buried with the most gold. They knew all of this because they had personally cut it from the stone. The state had spent generations creating a community of experts in royal tomb construction, then failed to pay them, and the outcome followed with the logic of inevitability. This was the Egypt Ramesses XI inherited when he came to the throne around 1107 BCE, an Egypt where the most sacred ground on earth was being systematically looted, an Egypt where the officials responsible for its protection were complicit in the looting, an Egypt where the craftsmen who had built the monuments of the gods were hungry enough to burn those gods for the metal in their wrappings. And then, within the first decade of his reign, the civil war began. Ramesses II held the title Viceroy of Kush, governing Egypt's Nubian territories and commanding what remained of the Southern Army. In approximately year 12 of Ramesses XI, around 1095 BCE, he marched north toward Thebes. The exact reasons are contested. The principal documentary sources, a handful of administrative papyri and references in the Deir el-Medina records, do not provide a clean narrative explanation. The American Egyptologist Robert Rittner has argued that Ramesses may have been responding to a genuine invitation from a Theban faction overwhelmed by internal conflict. Others see simple opportunism, a military commander with a functioning army and a clear view of the power vacuum at the center of Egyptian governance. Whatever his motivation, the result was military occupation of Egypt's most sacred city, conducted by Nubian troops under the command of a man who was neither pharaoh nor high priest nor official of the Theban administration. The administrative record from Deir el-Medina during the period of Ramesses' occupation becomes thin and fragmented. Normal institutional life was disrupted. References in surviving texts suggest severe grain shortages, commandeering of supplies by military units, breakdown of the routines that sustained the community. Work in the Valley of the Kings largely ceased, and it was during this period, in approximately years 17 through 19 of Ramesses XI, so around 1089 to 1087 BCE, that the administrative documents make reference to what scholars have named the Year of the Hyenas. The phrase appears in a handful of texts from this era. It describes a period of such severe famine and social breakdown that wild animals entered the settlements. In Egyptian symbolic thought, the hyena was an animal of the desert margins, an eater of the dead, a creature associated with the violation of boundaries between the ordered world and the chaos outside it. The image of hyenas in the streets of Thebes, one of the great cities of the ancient world, is not a picturesque ecological detail. In Egyptian cultural language, it is the precise image of the world turned upside down, of civilization's boundary with chaos dissolving. Ramesses XI dispatched a counterforce under a commander named Piank. Panahisi was expelled from Thebes and retreated south into Nubia, where he held territory and conducted raids before disappearing entirely from the historical record. He does not appear to have been captured or tried. He simply stops appearing in the sources, swallowed by the entropy of the era. But Panahisi's removal did not restore order to Thebes. It merely created the conditions for the next crisis, because Piank, the general who had driven out the viceroy, was also connected to the administration of the Amun temple, and in the aftermath of the Panahisi crisis, he accumulated titles and authority that would, in the hands of his successor, become the basis for something entirely new. His successor was Herihor. Herihor appears in the documentary record around year 19 of Ramesses XI, approximately 1088 BCE, holding simultaneously the offices of High Priest of Amun and General of the Army. The combination was unprecedented. The pharaoh sat above both roles in theory, the divine figure who unified sacred and military power in a single cosmic person. To hold both simultaneously in a single human being below the pharaoh was to replicate, in a subordinate figure, exactly the synthesis that was supposed to belong only to the king. Herihor moved quickly to formalize his authority. He took additional titles: Generalissimo, Overseer of the Granaries, Viceroy of Kush, and eventually Governor of Upper Egypt, a title that made him the effective civil administrator of the entire southern half of the country. He managed the Amun temple estates, which controlled roughly a third of Egypt's agricultural land. He directed the distribution of grain that fed the population of the south. He commanded the garrison troops. In every functional sense, he ruled Upper Egypt. And then, in the temple of Khonsu at Karnak, he ordered his name inscribed inside a royal cartouche, that oval loop of knotted rope that in Egyptian artistic convention enclosed the name of the king alone, the visual symbol of pharaonic identity that every Egyptian recognized instantly as the marker of royal personhood, was placed around the name of a priest. Herihor's figure was carved in the royal offering posture, performing rituals that only the pharaoh could legitimately conduct, depicted in the royal pose, wearing the double crown, holding the crook and flail. He was never formally crowned. He never claimed the full royal titulary. Ramesses XI's name still appeared at the head of official documents throughout Egypt. The pharaoh technically existed, but in the walls of Karnak, in the place the Egyptian religious imagination recognized as the most consequential, the person performing the sacred actions of kingship had a different name. Ramesses XI's response to all of this left no clear mark in the historical record. No military campaign to reassert pharaonic authority over the south. No trial. No formal confrontation. No official condemnation. Only the Wihem Mesut, the repeating of births, the Renaissance, a proclamation of a new era, resetting the official count of regnal years, presenting the reign not as decline but as cosmic renewal. Official documents would now be dated from year 1 of this new era. The clock was reset. It was a symbolic gesture. It changed nothing on the ground. Herihor continued to rule Thebes in everything but name. The tomb robberies continued. The workers of Deir el-Medina continued to struggle, and the bare stone walls of KV4 continued to wait in the dark for the painters and gilders who were not going to come. Ramesses XI died around 1077 BCE. His tomb was unfinished. His body has never been found in KV4. His mummy may have been moved to one of the collective burials of royal remains that the priests of the Third Intermediate Period conducted in the face of continued tomb robbery, or it may be elsewhere, or it may simply be gone. The 20th Dynasty ended with him. The new kingdom ended with him. Egypt did not collapse entirely, it divided. Smendes, a powerful figure in the northern delta, who was possibly connected to Ramesses XI by marriage, took the throne as first king of the 21st Dynasty and ruled from the delta city of Tanis. In the south, Herihor's successors continued to rule Thebes as hereditary high priests who functioned as kings. Egypt had not fallen, but the 500-year continuity of the new kingdom, the unbroken institutional tradition of pharaonic imperial power that had built Abu Simbel and the hypostyle hall at Karnak, and the Battle of Kadesh Treaty and the temples of Nubia, that tradition was finished. The story of Wenamun provides what may be the single most vivid snapshot of Egyptian decline in all of ancient literature. The Report of Wenamun is a text preserved on a papyrus discovered in Egypt in the 1880s and now held in the Pushkin State Museum of Fine Arts in Moscow. It describes, in narrative form, the journey of an Egyptian temple official named Wenamun, who was dispatched from Karnak to the Phoenician city of Byblos to purchase cedar wood for the sacred bark of Amun. The text is dated to approximately the early Wehemesut period, so around 1075 BCE by current estimates, placing it squarely in the reign of Ramesses XI. The journey becomes, almost immediately, a study in humiliation. At the port of Dor, a subordinate member of Wenamun's party steals the official travel funds. Wenamun complains to the local ruler, a prince named Beda, who is sympathetic but unhelpful. The thief has apparently fled, and Beda sees no reason to compensate Wenamun from his own treasury for a theft committed by one of Wenamun's own men. Wenamun waits, no compensation comes. He eventually sails on, and in a desperate attempt to recoup his losses, he impulsively takes silver from another ship he encounters, rationalizing that if Beda's people cannot return his stolen funds, he is entitled to take what he needs. He arrives at Byblos. The local ruler, a man named Zakarbal, is polite but entirely unimpressed. Wenamun is an official of the Temple of Amun, one of the most powerful religious institutions in the ancient world, sent to purchase cedar for a sacred vessel. In the 18th Dynasty, an Egyptian official arriving with this commission would have been received with the deference owed to a representative of the dominant superpower of the region. Zakarbal sends a message telling him to leave. Every day for 29 days, a messenger comes to tell Wenamun his ship is to depart. Eventually, an oracle in the court of Zakarbal indicates that the Egyptian envoy should be heard. An audience is granted, and in that audience, Zakarbal delivers to Wenamun one of the most devastating speeches in all of ancient Egyptian literature. He tells Wenamun that Byblos has been trading with Egypt since the beginning of time, that his fathers and his fathers' fathers and their fathers before them had served Egypt. But the relationship was one of commerce, not submission. Egypt had always paid for its cedar, and now Wenamun had arrived with nothing. No proper letter of authorization from the pharaoh himself, no silver, no gold, no merchandise. Why should Zakarbal trade on the basis of credentials from a high priest who was not a king? Why should he defer to Egypt when Egypt sent envoys who arrived penniless and without proper documentation? The speech is a precise enumeration of Egyptian decline. A Phoenician prince, whose city had been supplying cedar to Egypt for generations, was now comfortably enough in his own independent position that he could lecture an Egyptian official about the inadequacy of Egyptian institutional credibility. The world had changed. Egypt was no longer the automatic centre of gravity around which the Levantine city-states revolved. It was one party among several, obligated to pay its debts and provide proper documentation like anyone else. Wenamun eventually manages to obtain his cedar wood, after considerable difficulty, and after Zakarbal sends to Egypt for the payment that Wenamun had not brought. But the journey home is no easier. He is chased by enemies, driven off course, and the text as it survives ends mid-sentence in circumstances that suggest the rest of the papyrus has been lost. We do not know if Wenamun made it home. We do not know if the cedar reached Karnak. The story ends in suspension, the official of a great institution, stranded in an uncertain world. the authority that was supposed to protect him having thinned to the point of uselessness. Scholars debate whether the report of Wenamun is a literal historical document or a literary composition that uses the conventions of a travel narrative to explore the theme of Egyptian institutional decline. The American Egyptologist Edward Wente argued it was primarily literary. Others have maintained that it has too many specific, verifiable details to be pure fiction. The debate about its genre has, in a sense, obscured the more important point. Whether it describes specific real events or uses realistic details to convey a general truth, the report of Wenamun gives us a portrait of how Egypt was seen from outside in the reign of Ramesses XI. The great power of the Near East, the civilization that had built Abu Simbel and signed the first peace treaty in human history, was now sending officials who arrived without proper funds and had to wait a month for an audience with a minor Phoenician port ruler. That portrait is damning regardless of its precise genre. The physical state of KV4, Ramesses XI's tomb, tells a parallel story. Egyptian royal tombs were long-term projects. The cutting of the main corridors began early in a reign, with the expectation that the tomb would be completed over the course of what was hoped to be many years. The longer the reign, the more elaborate the tomb could be. Seti I, who reigned for approximately 15 years in the 19th Dynasty, left a tomb of breathtaking completeness, 137 meters long, descending through corridor after corridor to a pillared burial hall whose astronomical ceiling maps the Egyptian night sky and whose walls carry some of the finest painted reliefs in the entire Valley of the Kings. Ramesses II, with his 67-year reign, left a tomb more than 100 meters long, though badly damaged by ancient flooding and subsequent quarrying. Ramesses XI reigned for approximately 27 to 30 years. By the standards of earlier pharaohs, this should have been long enough to complete a substantial tomb. KV4 extends approximately 104 meters into the cliff, suggesting that the basic structural cutting was largely accomplished. But the decorative program, which in a properly completed New Kingdom royal tomb covers every square centimeter of every wall and ceiling with painted reliefs, the texts of the Amduat and the Book of Gates, the images of the king before the gods, the cartouches and the epithets and the sacred names, all of this is almost entirely absent. In the outermost corridors, there are traces of a grid system used to lay out the compositional scheme for wall paintings that were never executed. The grid marks are there. The paintings are not. Someone came, drew the planning grid, and then stopped. This absence is one of the most eloquent facts in the entire story of the New Kingdom's end. The planning grid means that preparations were made. Someone intended to paint those walls, but the intention was never fulfilled. The artisans who would have painted them were not available, or not paid, or not present, or working elsewhere. The institutional capacity to complete the most fundamental obligation of the Egyptian state, the proper burial of the pharaoh, had simply run dry. Ramesses XI died into an unfinished eternity, and no one came to finish it for him. The post-Amarna pharaohs of the New Kingdom had built some of the most complete and elaborate royal tombs in Egyptian history, precisely because they were compensating for the disruption of the Amarna period, re-establishing the sacred traditions, reasserting the cosmic claims of the pharaonic institution. Tutankhamun's tomb, though small, was crammed with such extraordinary wealth that its discovery in 1922 produced what one contemporary observer described as the day the 20th century met the ancient world. Horemheb, Seti I, Ramesses II, Ramesses III. Their tombs represent the full flowering of the New Kingdom funerary tradition, and then the tradition ran out. The last pharaoh of the New Kingdom was buried in an unfinished room, in a tomb that should have been magnificent and was instead bare stone, and it is in that bare stone that the truest epitaph of the era is written. There is another document from the final years of the New Kingdom that deserves close attention. The last known administrative register from Deir el-Medina, which records the work assignments of the royal tomb workers in the period around year 10 of the Wehem Mesut era. The register is notable not for what it records, but for what it stops recording. The entries become shorter, the gaps between recorded work periods become longer. Eventually, the entries stop entirely. The community of Deir el-Medina which had maintained the most continuous administrative record of any working community in the ancient world, running without significant interruption for roughly 400 years, simply fell silent. The last ostraca from the site, that can be confidently dated to the late 20th Dynasty, tell us that the community was still there, still functioning in some reduced capacity. But the work in the Valley of the Kings had effectively ceased. The craftsmen were not cutting or painting royal tombs any longer. The project was over. The village of Deir el-Medina itself was eventually abandoned, probably sometime in the early 21st Dynasty, and the population dispersed to the town of Medinet Habu nearby, sheltering inside the fortified walls of Ramesses III's mortuary complex for security. In leaving their village, the workers left behind the accumulated material of 400 years of community life. The ostraca, the papyri, the tools, the household goods, the objects they could not carry. These were eventually covered by sand and rubble, preserved in the dry desert air, waiting for the archaeologists of the 19th and 20th centuries, who would excavate them and discover, to their astonishment, one of the most complete pictures of ordinary life in the ancient world ever uncovered. The community that had sustained the Valley of the Kings left behind, in its abandonment, the records that would tell future generations what the Valley of the Kings had actually cost in human terms. The Egyptologist Yaroslav Cerny spent decades studying the Deir el-Medina papyri and ostraca in the mid-20th century, building an encyclopedic understanding of the community across its history. His assessment of what the late 20th Dynasty records show was measured but unambiguous. The community was experiencing, in his words, a progressive and irreversible deterioration of conditions, not a sudden collapse, not a dramatic disaster, a progressive irreversible deterioration. Those three words, precise as a clinical diagnosis, describe not just the fate of one worker's village, but the condition of the entire New Kingdom in its final century. Progressive, irreversible, deteriorating. The 300 years between the founding of the New Kingdom under Ahmose I and the reign of Ramesses XI saw the most sustained period of monumental construction in all of human history. To that point, scholars estimate that the New Kingdom pharaohs moved more stone, employed more skilled craftsmen, and produced more inscribed surface area than any comparable period anywhere on Earth before or since. The temples were not merely buildings. They were theological statements made in the most permanent medium available, stone. They were designed to last forever, to outlast the specific kings who built them, to continue performing their sacred function across eternity. The inscription at Abu Simbel dedicated to the memory of Ramesses II explicitly states that the temple was built for eternity. The Egyptians took that phrase seriously. They built to last. And yet, the civilization that built all of this, that organized all of those workers, and fed them and paid them and directed their labor across generations, that civilization could not sustain the institutional machinery required to finish one last tomb. The New Kingdom ran out, not of stone or ambition, but of administrative capacity, of trustworthy officials, of reliable supply chains, of the accumulated institutional knowledge. And while that turns large-scale collective action into architecture, everything that had made the New Kingdom magnificent was, by the reign of Ramesses XI, absent from the Valley of the Kings, not because anyone had decided to withdraw it, because it had been eroding, slowly and continuously, for a century, until there was nothing left to withdraw. The end of the New Kingdom was not a bang. It was not a fire. It was a silence that grew, year by year, until it became permanent. And it is that silence, preserved in the bare stone of KV4, that we carry forward into the rest of this story. But here is what makes this truly terrifying. Every element of the crisis, the faltering grain deliveries, the corrupt officials, the weakening dynasties, the growing autonomy of the priesthood, the civil conflict in the south, none of these things was new in the reign of Ramesses XI. They had been building for generations. The New Kingdom did not fall, it eroded. And erosion, by nature, is almost impossible to reverse, once it has reached sufficient depth, because every small accommodation makes the next accommodation easier, and by the time the full scale of what has been lost becomes visible, the loss is already beyond recovery. The collapse of the New Kingdom did not happen in isolation. It was one movement in a far larger pattern of civilizational failure that swept the ancient world in the centuries around 1200 BCE and the centuries that followed. To understand what happened to Egypt under Ramesses XI, and to understand why it matters beyond the boundaries of Egyptian history, you have to look at the world in which the new kingdom existed. Because the Egypt of the late Ramessids was not the only great power of the ancient Near East to hollow out and fail. It was one of a cluster of civilizations that reached extraordinary heights of complexity, organization, and monumental achievement, and then, by various routes, fell silent. Some fell quickly, some fell slowly, some fell in ways we still cannot fully explain. Each one is a chapter in a larger story about the fragility of everything human beings build. Chapter 1. The Bronze Age Collapse and the Sea Peoples. In approximately the decades around 1200 BCE, something extraordinary happened to the civilized world of the Eastern Mediterranean. Within the space of roughly 50 years, the Hittite Empire, one of the great powers of the ancient world, with its capital at Hyksos in what is now central Turkey, collapsed entirely. The city of Ugarit, the major trading metropolis on the Syrian coast, was destroyed and never rebuilt. The Mycenaean palace culture of Greece, which had produced the great citadels of Mycenae and Tiryns, and the tradition that would eventually be mythologized in the Iliad, collapsed. The great palace at Knossos in Crete, center of a civilization that had lasted for centuries, was abandoned. Trade networks that had connected Egypt to Cyprus, to the Aegean, to the Levant, to Anatolia, for hundreds of years broke down. The literate cultures of the palace societies, which had used writing for administrative and commercial record-keeping, stopped using writing. Linear B, the script of Mycenaean Greece, disappeared entirely, and Greece entered a period of roughly 300 years during which no writing is attested. The math is striking. In the span of a single human lifetime, the interconnected civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean lost the Hittite Empire, the Ugaritic trading city, the Mycenaean palace culture, and severely damaged Egypt. This was not a coincidence. Something connected these collapses, even if what connected them is still debated. In 1993, the scholar Robert Drews published a landmark study called The End of the Bronze Age, in which he surveyed the evidence for the collapse and concluded that it was primarily caused by changes in military technology, specifically the rise of infantry armies using swords and javelins who could defeat chariot forces in the right conditions. The palace societies of the Bronze Age had built their power on the chariot, an enormously expensive military asset that required bronze, horses, specialized craftsmen, and elaborate training. When new tactics emerged that could counter the chariot, the military superiority of the palace elites evaporated, and their political authority went with it. Drews's argument generated significant scholarly debate and partial acceptance. It is probably one piece of a more complex picture, a more recent synthesis, put forward by the archaeologist Eric Klein in his 2014 book, 1177 BC. The year civilization collapsed, argued that the collapse was not caused by any single factor, but by what Klein called a perfect storm, climate change producing drought, which reduced agricultural yields, which strained state finances, which weakened military capacity, combined with earthquake activity that damaged several major cities, combined with disruption of the trade networks that palace economies depended on, combined with the political opportunism of the Sea Peoples, who took advantage of the general weakness. No single factor was sufficient to bring down the Bronze Age world. The combination of all of them, arriving in the same general period, was overwhelming. Klein's perfect storm model is compelling, in part, because it matches what the surviving documents actually show. In the archive of the last king of Ugarit, recovered from the ruins of the city after its destruction in approximately 1185 BCE, there is a letter that was apparently never sent. It was found still in the kiln, still being fired when the city was attacked. The letter describes an urgent situation. The king of Alashia, probably Cyprus, writes to the king of Ugarit warning that enemy ships have been seen at sea. Another letter, from the king of Ugarit to the king of Alashia, acknowledges the warning and reports that Ugarit's own army and fleet are away. The city is exposed. The letter was never delivered. Within months or years, Ugarit was burned and abandoned, its great scribal school silent, its harbour empty, its warehouses ash. The sea peoples who struck Egypt under Ramesses III in approximately 1176 BCE were the same general movement of peoples that had already destroyed Ugarit and ended the Hittite Empire. Egyptian reliefs at Medinet Habu depict them in careful detail. Men in distinctive feathered headdresses, in horned helmets, in round shields, fighting on land and in the elaborate sea battle in the Nile Delta. Ramesses III defeated them. But Egypt's ability to mount that defence was achieved at tremendous cost, and the Egypt that defeated the Sea Peoples was not the Egypt that could subsequently maintain its empire in Canaan and its administrative grip on Nubia. The victory was the last great expenditure of imperial capacity. After it, there was not enough left to sustain everything that had to be sustained. The Egyptian New Kingdom, in this larger perspective, was not an exception to the Bronze Age collapse. It was a survivor of it, a civilization that absorbed the blow and kept going, but that had been permanently weakened by the impact. The next century and a half, from the death of Ramesses III to the death of Ramesses XI, was the slow process of that weakening working through the institutional fabric of the state. Chapter 2. The Kingdom of Ugarit. A civilization that vanished in a season's the city of Ugarit, on the Syrian coast near the modern city of Latakia, was excavated beginning in 1929 by the French archaeologist Claude Schaeffer. Schaeffer had been alerted to the site by the accidental discovery of a tomb by a Syrian farmer, and what he found when he began digging was one of the most important archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. A major Bronze Age port city, abandoned suddenly and completely around 1185 BCE, its destruction layer still clearly visible as a band of ash and burned brick, and within that layer and beneath it, an archive of clay tablets that preserved the city's correspondence, its legal documents, its literary texts, and its last desperate messages to the outside world. The tablet archive of Ugarit is extraordinary for many reasons, but perhaps most extraordinary is what it reveals about the interconnectedness of the Bronze Age world. Ugarit was a trading city, and its archive records commercial relationships with Egypt, with Cyprus, with the Hittites, with Babylon, with the Aegean Islands. It was a city where multiple languages were spoken and written: Ugaritic, Akkadian, Hurrian, Hittite, Egyptian hieroglyphics. It was a city where a merchant from Cyprus could conduct business with a merchant from Egypt using a common diplomatic language, Akkadian, and receive legal protection from a local court that recognized the contracts of both. It was, in short, a node in the most sophisticated international trading network the world had yet seen. When Schaeffer cleared the destruction layer, he found evidence of a catastrophe that had come without warning. The last kiln firing of tablets, with its undelivered letters, houses burned with household goods still inside, the inhabitants having had no time to remove their possessions. A bronze foundry destroyed mid-operation. The city was not merely abandoned, it was overwhelmed quickly, violently, and completely, and it was never rebuilt. The site of Ugarit sat under its tell for 3,000 years, undisturbed except by ploughing, until the farmer's plough struck the roof of that Bronze Age tomb and Schaeffer began to dig. The lead archaeologist of the later Ugarit excavations, Marguerite Yon, who directed the French mission to Ras Shamra, the modern name for the site, from 1978 to 2004, wrote of the experience of working in the destruction layer. You find yourself standing in the moment of the catastrophe. The objects are exactly where they fell. The food was still on the table. The correspondence was still in the archive. Time stopped here, and 3,000 years later, we are the first people to look at it. That is not a novelist. That is a scientist describing what the archaeological evidence forced her to accept. An entire civilization, frozen in the moment of its destruction. Ugarit's collapse and Egypt's slow decline under the late Ramessids are connected not merely by chronology but by causation. The destruction of the Bronze Age trading network, of which Ugarit was a central node, was one of the pressures that stressed the Egyptian imperial economy in the 12th century BCE. The flow of copper from Cyprus, of cedar from Lebanon, of the luxury goods that moved through Ugaritian intermediaries was disrupted. Egypt's ability to sustain its military and its administrative apparatus depended on access to these materials at predictable cost. When the trading network broke down, the costs rose and the supply became erratic. This was not the primary cause of Egypt's decline, but it was a contributing factor in the complex of pressures that the late 20th Dynasty could not manage. Chapter 3. The Anasazi Abandonment. A pattern across millennia. More than 7,000 kilometers from the Nile Valley, in the high desert plateau of the American Southwest, a civilization built extraordinary things and then left. The ancestral Puebloans, once called the Anasazi, a name now largely replaced by the more respectful ancestral Pueblo people, inhabited the Colorado Plateau from roughly the 1st century CE through the 13th century CE. They built cliff dwellings of breathtaking ambition, multi-story stone structures tucked into natural alcoves in the canyon walls, accessible only by hand and foot holds cut into the cliff face, invisible from below until you are nearly on top of them. They built kivas, circular ceremonial chambers, some of them enormous in scale, suggesting sophisticated ritual life and complex social organization. They built roads, straight lines cut into the desert surface for hundreds of kilometers, with no curves and no apparent accommodation to topography, roads that modern researchers still debate the purpose of. At Chaco Canyon in what is now New Mexico, they built what appears to have been the center of a regional civilization. Great houses of extraordinary scale and sophistication, some of them containing hundreds of rooms, built to precise astronomical alignments, the largest of which, Pueblo Bonito, covered approximately 860 square meters of floor space and may have stood 4 or 5 stories high in places. Chaco was not a city in the ordinary sense. It appears to have been a ceremonial center, a place of pilgrimage and redistribution, the hub of a network that extended hundreds of kilometers in every direction. And then, in the late 13th century CE, the ancestral Pueblo people left. Not Chaco alone, not a single site or region, but the entire Colorado Plateau. Within the span of roughly 2 generations, the great houses of Chaco were abandoned, the cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde were empty, the roads were silent. An entire regional civilization, representing centuries of accumulated architectural knowledge, of social organization, of religious tradition, simply relocated. The descendants of the ancestral Pueblo people are the modern Pueblo peoples of the Rio Grande Valley and the Hopi and Zuni communities of New Mexico and Arizona. They did not disappear, they moved. But the civilization of the Colorado Plateau, with its cliff dwellings and its great houses and its road system and its Chacoan cosmology, was over. The explanation most widely accepted among archaeologists today is multi-causal. A series of severe droughts in the late 13th century, documented by tree ring analysis that shows anomalously narrow growth rings, indicating drought years across the southwest, combined with social tensions within the Chacoan system, possibly including conflict over resources, religious schism, or the failure of the ceremonial system to deliver the rains it was understood to promise. The droughts were real. The abandonment was real. The connection between them is supported by the timing, but the precise mechanisms remain debated. What makes the ancestral Pueblo collapse relevant to the story of Ramesses XI is the pattern it represents. 2 very different civilizations, separated by thousands of kilometers and thousands of years, following similar trajectories. Long periods of construction and institutional elaboration, followed by environmental stress, followed by institutional failure, followed by abandonment. The specific mechanisms differ. The cultures are utterly unlike, but the pattern is recognizable. Climate stress reveals institutional brittleness that was always there but invisible in better times. When the margin for error narrows, systems that functioned adequately in normal conditions suddenly cannot sustain themselves. The buildings are left empty. The roads are left silent. The elaborately maintained institutions are left to the wind and the sand. The ancestral Pueblo people, unlike the population of the late New Kingdom, eventually found new territory and rebuilt their communities. Their descendants still practice ceremonial traditions that trace their roots to the Chacoan world. In this sense, their story is more of a migration and transformation than a collapse. But the great houses of Chaco, the cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde, the road system of the Colorado Plateau, These things were not rebuilt. That specific expression of civilization, that particular accumulation of architectural knowledge and social organization, was finished when the people left. And from the outside, from the perspective of future archaeologists who came to those empty canyon walls, without the context of living descendants, it looked exactly like what it was, a civilization that had vanished. Chapter 4. The Khmer Empire and Angkor. When the water failed in 1860, a French naturalist and explorer named Henri Mouhot was pushing through the jungle of what is now Cambodia, following a river whose route his guides knew by instinct rather than map. He had been travelling for days through dense forest, living on provisions that were running low, and he was tired and sick with the intermittent fever that would eventually kill him. And then his guide stopped, and he looked up, and he saw stone, not a boulder, not an outcropping, a wall, a carved wall, rising above the root mass of an enormous strangler fig that had grown through and around it for centuries. He followed the wall. It became a corridor. The corridor opened into a courtyard. The courtyard was surrounded by towers, each tower capped with a carved stone face, dozens of faces, all staring outward through the jungle with an expression of serene, timeless attention that stopped him where he stood. He continued into the complex. It grew larger with every corridor he entered. He walked for hours. The complex was enormous. The central tower, the concentric enclosures, the causeways stretching out in 4 cardinal directions over artificial moats, the galleries of carved bas-reliefs running for hundreds of meters, depicting Hindu cosmology and the military campaigns of a king whose name he did not yet know. By the end of the day, Mouhot understood that he was standing in the center of what had been a city of extraordinary size and sophistication. He named it Angkor Wat, from the Khmer words meaning temple city. Angkor Wat was not the whole of Angkor. It was one temple among many in a complex that, at its height in the 12th and 13th centuries CE, covered an area of roughly 1,000 square kilometers and housed a population that modern LiDAR imaging of the forest around the temples suggests may have been somewhere between 700,000 and 1 million people. The latest LiDAR surveys, conducted by the Cambodian Archaeological LiDAR Initiative and published in recent years, revealed a grid of streets, canals, reservoirs, and residential neighborhoods extending far beyond the monuments that had been known since Mouhot's time. Angkor was not just a ceremonial center with a few temples. It was one of the largest pre-industrial cities on Earth, a hydraulic civilization that managed the monsoon water of the Cambodian plain through an intricate network of canals, reservoirs, and distribution channels to sustain agricultural production for 1 million people in a landscape of extreme seasonal variability. At its height, the Khmer Empire controlled territory stretching from the Gulf of Thailand to what is now southern Vietnam, into Laos and parts of modern Thailand. Its kings built monuments whose ambition matched the greatest building programs of the ancient world. Angkor Wat itself covers an area of roughly 250 hectares within its outer moat and is the largest religious monument on Earth by some measures. The outer moat alone is roughly 5.5 kilometers in circumference, and the central tower rises more than 65 meters above the temple platform. The bas-reliefs in the third gallery, if laid out end to end, would extend for approximately 800 meters. They depict, with extraordinary precision and artistic quality, scenes from the Hindu epics Ramayana and Mahabharata, the churning of the cosmic ocean, and the military victories of the king Suryavarman II, who commissioned the temple in the 12th century CE. Angkor's decline, which unfolded across the 14th and 15th centuries CE, is one of the most extensively researched archaeological questions of recent decades. The traditional explanation emphasized Thai military pressure from the west. The kingdoms of Sukhothai and Ayutthaya, expanding in what is now Thailand, repeatedly attacked Angkor, sacking the city in 1351 and 1431 CE. The final sack in 1431 is traditionally given as the date of Angkor's abandonment. The Khmer court relocated south to what is now Phnom Penh, a position better placed to take advantage of the maritime trade that was becoming increasingly important in the region. But recent research, including detailed analysis of Angkor's hydraulic system, has suggested that the city's vulnerability to Thai attack may have been the product of a deeper crisis rather than its primary cause. The hydraulic infrastructure that sustained Angkor's enormous population was extraordinarily complex and required continuous management and maintenance. Climate analysis of the period, drawing on tree ring records and lake sediment cores from across Southeast Asia, shows that the 14th and 15th centuries were characterized by extreme climate variability, periods of severe drought alternating with unusually intense monsoons. The drought periods would have reduced agricultural production and strained the food supply. The intense monsoon periods would have overwhelmed the hydraulic infrastructure, causing the canal systems to silt up faster than they could be maintained. The sediment analysis of Angkor's reservoirs shows exactly this pattern: layers of heavy deposition consistent with flood events, interspersed with layers consistent with reduced water flow. The hydraulic system that was the foundation of Angkor's population capacity was failing, and as it failed, the administrative complexity required to manage it became harder to sustain. The people who maintained the canals needed to be fed. The officials who directed the maintenance needed to be paid. If the system was producing less food, there was less to distribute, which meant less capacity to maintain the system, which meant the system produced less food. This is the feedback loop of civilizational collapse. The failure of one system reduces the capacity to maintain other systems, and the cascading failures reinforce each other until the whole structure is unsustainable. The Angkor researchers Brendan Buckley and Mary Beth Day, analyzing tree ring records from across Southeast Asia, identified two major multi-decade droughts in the 14th and 15th centuries, separated by an anomalously intense wet period. Their conclusion was direct. The hydraulic civilization of Angkor, which had been designed to manage the relatively predictable monsoon cycle of the preceding centuries, was not able to adapt to the climate variability of the 14th and 15th centuries. The infrastructure could be maintained against normal seasonal variation. It could not be maintained against decades of alternating extreme drought and extreme flood. This is the pattern we find again and again across the archaeological record of collapsed civilizations. Not invasion alone, not drought alone, not institutional corruption alone, but the combination. External pressure arrives at exactly the moment when internal capacity to respond has been compromised by accumulated institutional failure, and the civilization cannot manage the crisis, because the crisis arrives when the civilization is already stretched. Angkor was not invulnerable before the Thai attacks. It was already in the process of hydraulic failure, already losing the agricultural foundation that sustained its population, already unable to maintain the institutional complexity that had built and managed its remarkable infrastructure. The military attacks were not the cause of Angkor's fall. They were the shock that a weakened system could no longer absorb. This is also the pattern of the late New Kingdom. Egypt under Ramesses XI was not destroyed by the Panihisi revolt, or by the institutional overreach of Herihor, or by the tomb robberies, or by the failure of grain deliveries to Deir el-Medina. All of these were symptoms of a deeper failure, the progressive inability of the pharaonic state to sustain the mutual obligations that held its institutional fabric together. Each failure made the next failure more likely. Each compromise made the next compromise easier. And the result, in the end, was a pharaoh who could not finish his own tomb. Chapter 5. Cahokia, the American city that forgot itself across the Mississippi River. From what is now the city of St. Louis, Missouri, there are earthen mounds. Monk's Mound, the largest of them, covers an area of approximately 5.2 hectares at its base, and rises more than 30 meters, making it the largest pre-Columbian earthwork in North America, and one of the largest earthen structures anywhere in the ancient world. It was built in stages over several centuries, beginning around 900 CE and reaching its final form around 1100 CE. At its summit, archaeologists have found evidence of a large wooden building, perhaps a chief's residence or a ceremonial structure. The mound is aligned to specific solar events in a way that suggests sophisticated astronomical knowledge, and around it, across an area of roughly 14 square kilometers, there were once dozens of smaller mounds, plazas, wooden palisades, and residential neighborhoods housing what archaeologists estimate was a population of between 10 and 20,000 people. at the city's peak in approximately 1100 CE. This was Cahokia. Its ancient name is unknown. The people who built it left no written records. Their language is lost. Their religious system must be reconstructed from the archaeological evidence of the mounds, the burials, the artifacts, and comparisons with later Native American traditions in the region. What the archaeology shows is a city of extraordinary organizational capacity. The construction of Monk's Mound alone required moving approximately 22 million cubic feet of earth, carried in baskets by human hands over a period of centuries. This was not the work of a casual community. This was a civilization with long-term institutional memory, with the ability to organize large labor forces, to sustain a project across generations, to plan on timescales that exceeded the lifetime of any individual. In approximately 1200 CE, something changed. The population of Cahokia began to decline. The archaeological evidence for what happened is, as is so often the case, frustratingly indirect. There is evidence of a flood around 1100 to 1150 CE that may have damaged lower-lying parts of the settlement. There is evidence of a drought period around 1200 CE, documented in tree ring records from the central Mississippi Valley. There is evidence that a wooden palisade was built around the central precinct of the city around the same time, suggesting that internal security had become a concern, that the city was, in some sense, fortifying itself against its own hinterland. And by approximately 1350 CE, Cahokia was effectively abandoned. The mounds remained, the people were gone. The archaeologist Timothy Porktat, who has written extensively on Cahokia, argues that its decline was not primarily caused by environmental stress, but by the inherent instability of the social system that had produced it. A highly centralized, charismatic chieftainship that was powerful when a great leader could maintain the personal authority required to hold together an ethnically and culturally diverse population, but brittle when that authority weakened, or when the cosmic mandate that underwrote it failed to deliver the expected benefits. Cahokia's leaders, he argues, derive their authority in part from their claimed ability to mediate between the human world and the supernatural forces that governed agricultural fertility and seasonal renewal. When drought came, or flood, or simple crop failure, the cosmic claims of the ruling elite were tested. If the tests were failed too many times, the institutional loyalty that sustained the city's labor and food tribute began to erode. The numbers are striking. Cahokia at its peak was larger than the contemporary city of London. It was the largest settlement north of Mexico for centuries, and it was abandoned so completely that when European explorers arrived in the Mississippi Valley in the 16th and 17th centuries, they found no one who remembered it. The mounds were there, the artifact evidence was there, buried in the soil, but the oral traditions that might have preserved the memory of Cahokia, the story of why it rose and why it fell, were gone. The civilization that built the largest earthwork in North America had vanished so thoroughly that its very name was forgotten. This is perhaps the most haunting fact about lost civilizations. Not that they fell, but that they were forgotten. Not just by outsiders, not just by people who had no reason to remember them, but by the descendants of the people who had built them. The memory that was not preserved in stone or written record or durable tradition simply ceased to exist. The city became a mystery, even to the people who were, in biological terms, its inheritors. The new kingdom of Egypt was luckier than Cahokia. The Egyptians had hieroglyphics. They had papyrus. They had stone inscriptions that survived 3,000 years. They had the physical monuments, the temples and the tombs, that preserve enough to allow historians and archaeologists to reconstruct at least the broad outlines of what happened. But even with all of that, there are enormous gaps. We do not know where Ramesses XI is buried. We do not know exactly what Herihor said to Ramesses XI, or whether they ever met in person, or whether the pharaoh understood what was happening to his dynasty. We do not know the names of the craftsmen who drew the planning grid on the bare walls of KV4 and then put down their tools and walked away. We have the grid. We do not have the people. The silence in those unfinished corridors is not just the absence of paint and gold. It is the absence of everything that is not stone. The voices, the plans, the final negotiations, the moment when someone decided there was no point in continuing. 3,000 years of silence, and all we can do is stand at the entrance and look in, and try to understand what the emptiness means. Chapter 6. The Indus Valley Civilization. The cities that left no kings, perhaps the most haunting lost civilization of the ancient world, is one that left almost no trace of its rulers. The Indus Valley Civilization, also called the Harappan Civilization, after the site of Harappa in what is now Pakistan, flourished from approximately 2600 to 1900 BCE, making it roughly contemporary with the Egyptian Old Kingdom and the early dynastic period of Mesopotamia. At its height, the Indus Valley Civilization covered an area of approximately 1.5 million square kilometers, larger than the Old Kingdom of Egypt and ancient Mesopotamia combined. Its two largest cities, Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, each had populations estimated between 20 and 50,000 people, making them among the largest urban settlements on Earth for their time. The cities themselves were extraordinary. They were built on a grid plan. The streets ran at right angles. They had underground drainage systems, brick-lined sewers running beneath the streets, connected to drains in the houses, capable of handling the wastewater of tens of thousands of people. The bricks used in construction were manufactured to standardized dimensions across the entire civilization's extent, the same proportions in Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, and dozens of smaller settlements spread across the Indus Valley and beyond. Standardized weights were used across the civilization, permitting consistent measurement over a geographical range of more than 1,000 kilometers. The artifact evidence includes finely worked jewelry, carnelian beads of extraordinary quality, small carved seals with pictographic inscriptions and animal imagery, toys with movable parts, board games. And yet, no kings, no royal palaces in the sense familiar from Egypt or Mesopotamia, no images of rulers in poses of dominance or conquest, no royal burial grounds with the ostentatious concentration of wealth that marks the graves of pharaohs and kings, no inscriptions celebrating military victories or claiming divine mandate for political authority. The Indus Valley Civilization appears to have been organized and coordinated in ways that produce cities as large as anything in the ancient world. Without the visible apparatus of centralized kingship, we cannot read their writing. The Indus script, with its approximately 429 distinct signs, remains undeciphered. Every serious attempt to crack it over the past century has either failed or generated results too disputed to be accepted. Without the writing, we have no names, no stories, no religious texts, no laws, no correspondence. We have the cities, and the artifacts, and the infrastructure, and the standardized weights, and the mysterious seals. We have the evidence of extraordinary organizational capacity, and absolutely no idea what the organization was called, who led it, what they believed, or what they said to each other. The British archaeologist John Marshall excavated Mohenjo-daro beginning in 1922. He stood at the edge of a trench in what was then part of British India, staring at something that made no sense to him. A perfectly planned street, lined with buildings made of uniform bricks, all of them the same size, all of them laid in a running bond pattern that was the most structurally efficient method available. He followed the street. It became a neighborhood. The neighborhood was part of a city with a lower town of residential buildings laid out on a grid and an upper citadel with large public structures, a granary, a large bath, and buildings whose function is still debated. Marshall later wrote that the Mohenjo-daro excavation revealed a highly developed culture whose civilization was practically equal in quality to that of ancient Mesopotamia. That is a precise assessment, and it was made by a man staring at streets that were already 2,300 years old before the birth of Christ. The Indus Valley Civilization appears to have declined beginning around 1900 BCE. By 1700 BCE, the great cities were largely abandoned. The exact causes remain debated. Earlier theories emphasized invasion by Aryan-speaking peoples from the northwest, the so-called Aryan invasion theory, but the archaeological evidence for this scenario has been substantially discredited. There is no evidence of the kind of violent destruction that would be expected from a military conquest, and the genetic and physical anthropological record does not support a major population replacement at this time. More recent research has focused on climate change. Evidence from paleoclimate studies suggests that monsoon rainfall in the Indus Valley decreased significantly around 1900 BCE, reducing agricultural productivity and forcing a reorganization of settlement patterns toward areas with more reliable rainfall in the east. The large urban centers in the west, which depended on the monsoon-fed Indus River and its tributaries for irrigation, became unsustainable. But even this explanation leaves questions unanswered. Why did the standardized weights stop being used? Why did the distinctive Indus material culture, the specific pottery styles, the seals, the carefully made beads, fade out so completely rather than persisting in modified form? Why did the writing, whatever it was and whatever it recorded, simply stop? The script appears on objects from the height of the Harappan period and then disappears from the record entirely. 3,000 years after the Indus Valley civilization ended, no descendant culture appears to have preserved any memory of it. It was not merely abandoned. It was forgotten, as completely as Cahokia, as completely as all those civilizations whose stories survive only in the language that archaeology speaks, the language of artifacts and ruins, and the things that last when everything else is gone. Chapter 7. The Division of Egypt. What came after Ramesses XI, the third intermediate period that followed the New Kingdom, lasted from approximately 1070 BCE to 664 BCE, according to current scholarly consensus. It was not a period of catastrophic collapse in the sense of total civilizational failure. Egypt continued. The temples continued to function. The priests continued to perform the ancient rituals. The hieroglyphic writing system continued to be used. In many respects, the physical culture of ancient Egypt was remarkably continuous across the third intermediate period and beyond. But the political structure was fractured in ways that had real consequences. In the north, the 21st Dynasty ruled from the delta city of Tanis. The kings of Tanis were real kings. They used the full pharaonic titulary. They were buried in elaborate tombs within the temple precinct of Tanis. Some of those burials containing silver and gold coffins of extraordinary quality that were discovered by the French archaeologist Pierre Montet in 1939 and 1940, a discovery that would have electrified the world had it not occurred in the first months of World War II and been immediately overshadowed by more urgent events. The tombs of Tanis were not as large or as magnificently decorated as the great tombs of the Valley of the Kings, but they contained real wealth, real royal burial equipment, real evidence of continued pharaonic tradition. In the south, the high priests of Amun at Karnak governed Upper Egypt as hereditary rulers, using the cartouche, performing the royal religious functions, and managing the enormous economic resources of the Amun temple estates. The priest rulers of the south did not claim the full pharaonic titulary in exactly the way the kings of the north did, but in practice they were autonomous rulers of an effectively independent territory. Egypt had split, not cleanly and not formally, but functionally. The Nile Valley that had been unified under a single divine king for nearly 500 years was now a two-part structure with communication between north and south maintained by family connections, by shared religious tradition, and by the theoretical acknowledgement of a common pharaonic framework that both parties observed in form while largely ignoring in practice. The fragmentation deepened in the 22nd Dynasty, when Libyan chieftains who had been settled in the Delta for generations essentially took over the kingship. The 22nd Dynasty kings were of Libyan descent, bearing Egyptian throne names and performing Egyptian royal rituals while maintaining the cultural connections of their ethnic background. They ruled Egypt, but they also appointed their sons as high priests and military commanders in ways that eventually produced a multiplication of competing power centers, different lines of the same family controlling different cities, issuing their own dates, conducting their own foreign policies. By the 8th century BCE, the country was effectively divided into several independent principalities, each acknowledging some theoretical degree of pharaonic authority while operating independently. The reunification came, in the end, not from within Egypt, but from Nubia. The kings of the Kushite kingdom at Napata, in the Sudan, who had grown up in a culture deeply shaped by Egyptian religious tradition, who worshipped Amun and were buried under steep-sided pyramids in the Egyptian style, marched north in the 8th century BCE and reunited Egypt under their rule as the 25th Dynasty. The Kushite pharaohs were, in a deeply ironic historical loop, the descendants of the people over whom Egypt had once exercised colonial dominion, the people whose gold had funded the new kingdom's monuments, the people from whose territory Panasi had marched north to begin the crisis of Ramesses XI's reign. They became the pharaohs who temporarily reversed the fragmentation the new kingdom's collapse had produced. But even the Kushite reunification could not restore what the new kingdom had been. The international empire was gone. The Levantine vassals were gone. The Nubian gold mines, now the territory of the very dynasty that had conquered Egypt, were no longer an Egyptian resource. The new kingdom's 500-year run as the dominant superpower of the ancient Near East was finished permanently. Egypt would continue for another 1,000 years as a significant regional power, and eventually as the object of Alexander the Great's conquest, and then of Roman colonization. Its temples would continue to be built and expanded. Its priesthoods would continue to function. Its hieroglyphic writing system would persist until the closing of the Temple of Philae in the 4th century CE, making it the longest-lived writing system in human history. But the specific institutional and imperial achievement of the new kingdom, the Egypt that built Abu Simbel and signed the first peace treaty, and sent the Punt expedition, and produced Thutmose III and Ramesses II, that Egypt was finished when Ramesses XI closed his eyes for the last time. We have travelled far. From the unfinished corridors of KV4 in the Valley of the Kings, we have moved to the ash layer at Ugarit and the cliff dwellings of the Colorado Plateau, and the stone faces of Angkor, and the earthen mounds of Cahokia, and the undeciphered seals of Mohenjo-Daro. We have followed the collapse of the Bronze Age trading network that the Sea Peoples helped destroy and the Egyptian state partly absorbed and was permanently weakened by. We have watched a succession of 8 barely remembered pharaohs fail to maintain what their predecessors had built, and we have watched the labour strike at Deir el-Medina and the tomb robbery crisis and the Panahisi revolt and the year of the hyenas and the quiet, devastating moment when a pharaoh's tomb was left unfinished, because there was no longer enough institutional will or institutional capacity to finish it. Now it is time to draw the pattern together, because there is a pattern, and it is not unique to Egypt, not unique to the Bronze Age, not unique to the ancient world. It is a pattern that runs through the archaeological record of human civilization, from the earliest cities to the present day, and understanding it is the reason this story matters beyond the intrinsic fascination of its details. The first element of the pattern is what we might call the institutional debt problem. Every complex civilization runs on accumulated institutional trust. The farmers deliver grain because they trust that the state will protect their fields and adjudicate their disputes. The craftsmen build the temples and the tombs because they trust that the grain will arrive. The soldiers defend the borders because they trust that their families will be provisioned and their service honoured. The officials perform their administrative functions because they trust that the system they serve is legitimate and functional. When these chains of trust are working, the whole edifice produces outputs far beyond what any individual or small group could produce. Temples, armies, irrigation systems, trading networks, the accumulated surplus of organized effort. But the chains of trust are not self-maintaining. They require continuous reinvestment. The grain has to actually arrive. The disputes have to actually be adjudicated. The service has to actually be honoured. And when the state begins to fail to meet these obligations, not catastrophically all at once, but incrementally, partially, with delays and shortfalls and excuses, the trust begins to erode. Each broken obligation makes the next one easier to break. Each defection from the system makes the system slightly less able to prevent the next defection. The institutional fabric frays a thread at a time, invisibly from a distance, until the day when the whole thing tears. This is what the labour strike at Deir el-Medina was telling us. The craftsmen who put down their tools and marched to the mortuary temples were not making a radical revolutionary statement. They were doing what rational people do when institutional obligations are not being met. They were refusing to meet their own obligations in return. But their refusal was itself a symptom of a system in which the basic reciprocal logic of the state had broken down. The grain was not arriving because the central administration no longer had the organizational capacity or the political will to ensure it arrived. The craftsmen were not being paid because the pharaoh's government was no longer governing effectively enough to pay them. The strike was the alarm bell, but the fire had been smouldering for decades before anyone pulled it. The second element of the pattern is what we might call the visibility problem. Institutional decay is, by its nature, invisible until it becomes catastrophic. The organizations and systems that hold a civilization together do not announce their degradation. The official who takes a bribe does not record it in the administrative archives. The village headman who stops enforcing the grain collection does not write a report explaining why. The temple official who diverts resources from royal accounts to Amun temple accounts does not leave a memo. The decay happens in the spaces between the records, in the decisions that are never documented, in the habits that slowly shift from compliance to evasion without any single moment of formal transition. This is why the collapse of the New Kingdom looks, from the outside, like a series of discrete crises. The assassination of Ramesses III, the tomb robberies, the Panahisi revolt, the Wehem Mesut proclamation, but these were not the causes. They were the visible eruptions of a process that had been underway for generations, in the quiet accumulation of 1,000 small failures that no single person could see in their totality. The Egyptians living through the decline of the 20th Dynasty did not experience it as a linear narrative of collapse. They experienced it as a series of difficulties, each one troubling, none of them obviously fatal, until, all at once, a generation of children grew up who had never known a state that worked the way it was supposed to work. This is the deepest truth about civilizational collapse. It is not dramatic from the inside. It is slow. It is incremental. It is made up of ordinary decisions by ordinary people responding rationally to the circumstances immediately in front of them. The official who takes the bribe is not thinking about the fall of civilization. He is thinking about feeding his family or advancing his career, or simply taking advantage of an opportunity that custom and circumstance have made available. The village headman who stops enforcing the grain collection is not thinking about the structural failure of the pharaonic state. He is thinking about his relationships in the community, about the resentment that enforcement would generate, about the practical impossibility of coercing people who have become accustomed to non-compliance. Each individual decision is local and comprehensible. The aggregate is the end of a civilization. The archaeologist Eric Klein, whose work on the Bronze Age collapse we encountered in Section 4, has argued that the civilizations of the Bronze Age were brought down not by any single cause, but by what he calls a perfect storm, the simultaneous failure of multiple independent systems, each of which had been functioning adequately in normal conditions, but none of which had been designed to handle the level of stress that arrived in the 12th century BCE. Drought weakened agricultural production. The weakening of agricultural production reduced the economic surplus that sustained trade. The reduction of trade disrupted the supply of metals and other materials that were fundamental to military capacity and to the production of luxury goods that sustained elite social structures. The disruption of elite social structures weakened the political authority that maintained internal order. The weakening of internal order made the state more vulnerable to external pressure, and the external pressure, when it came in the form of the sea peoples and the migrations of desperate populations, arrived at exactly the moment when the states of the Eastern Mediterranean were least able to absorb it. Egypt survived the Bronze Age collapse better than most of its neighbours. It was geographically more defensible. It had the Nile, which provided a relatively reliable agricultural base even in years when the Mediterranean weather patterns were disrupted. It had institutional depth, a bureaucratic tradition stretching back 1,500 years that could absorb shocks and continue functioning even under severe stress. It had the prestige and the physical mass of its temples and its monuments, which served as anchors of social identity and political legitimacy. even when the political structures around them were faltering. But surviving the Bronze Age collapse was not the same as surviving it intact. The Egypt that emerged from the 12th century BCE was weaker than the Egypt that had entered it, structurally compromised in ways that the external events had not created but had revealed and accelerated. The third element of the pattern, perhaps the most counterintuitive, is that complexity itself is a vulnerability. The New Kingdom was, by any measure, an extraordinarily complex civilization. Its administrative apparatus was vast, a network of officials at multiple levels, managing the collection and redistribution of grain, the organization of temple estates, the coordination of military campaigns, the management of foreign tribute, the direction of building projects on a scale that required planning over decades. Its economy was deeply specialized. Deir el-Medina was an entire community of people who did nothing but design and build royal tombs, supported entirely by the surplus production of agricultural communities elsewhere in the country. Its religious system was architecturally and ritually elaborate to a degree that required substantial ongoing investment to maintain. All of this complexity was, in the good centuries, what made Egypt extraordinarily productive. Specialization produces efficiency. Administrative coordination allows the direction of resources toward large-scale projects. Deep institutional networks allow knowledge and capacity to accumulate across generations. The New Kingdom could build Abu Simbel because it had the administrative machinery to organize hundreds of craftsmen and laborers over the course of 20 years, and the agricultural surplus to feed them, and the transportation infrastructure to supply them, and the military capacity to protect the supply lines, and the religious ideology to motivate the effort. None of these components in isolation could have built anything. Together, they could move mountains. But complexity also means fragility. Each additional link in the chain of interdependencies is another point of failure. Deir el-Medina was not just a community of skilled craftsmen. It was a community of skilled craftsmen that could not exist without continuous grain deliveries from administrative centers that had to be coordinated with agricultural surplus from farming. Communities across Egypt, mediated by a bureaucratic apparatus that had to be functioning at every level to translate the grain in the fields into bread on the craftsmen's tables. Remove any one link and the whole sequence fails. The craftsmen do not eat, the tombs do not get built. The pharaoh's journey to the afterlife is compromised. The cosmic order on which the state's legitimacy rests is threatened. Modern systems theorists call this tight coupling, the property of a system in which the components are so closely interdependent that a failure in one part propagates rapidly through the whole. Tightly coupled systems are efficient in normal operations. They are dangerously brittle under stress. The New Kingdom was, in the later Ramessid period, a tightly coupled system under increasing stress, managed by increasingly weak political authority, with decreasing margins for error and decreasing institutional capacity to absorb failures before they cascaded. The labor strike at Deir el-Medina was a symptom of tight coupling. The grain had failed to arrive not because of any dramatic agricultural catastrophe, but because the administrative links in the chain between the fields and the workers' tables had frayed enough to cause repeated interruptions, and the response to the interruptions was itself damaging. Each time the system failed and the workers struck, the normalization of crisis deepened a little further. The fourth element of the pattern is the most important for understanding the story of Ramesses XI specifically. It is the way that institutional failure tends to concentrate at the top. As a complex state begins to lose the capacity to maintain its obligations throughout the hierarchy, the defaults tend to accumulate where they are most visible and most consequential. The ordinary farmers in the villages are managed by local officials who have an incentive to maintain local order, regardless of what is happening at the national level. The ordinary craftsmen in the provincial towns continue to work because their immediate economic relationships still function. But at the apex of the system, where national coordination is required, where resources have to be assembled from across the country and directed toward specific royal projects, the failures concentrate. This is why the tomb was unfinished. Not because Egypt had collapsed, it had not. Not because the craftsmen of Deir el-Medina had lost their skill, they had not. Not because stone was unavailable, or the will to build was absent. None of these things. The tomb of Ramesses XI was unfinished because the specific act of completing it required the coordinated application of national resources under royal direction, and that specific capacity, the capacity of the pharaoh's government to direct national resources toward royal projects, was exactly the capacity that had been most thoroughly eroded by the institutional failures of the preceding century. The granaries were still full enough to feed the craftsmen. The craftsmen were still skilled enough to cut and paint the tomb. But the administrative and political machinery that would have organized those resources and directed that skill toward that specific purpose had been captured by other priorities, other power centers, other agendas. Herihor was building his own monument. The Amun temple was investing in its own future. The king's government was administering what remained of the king's direct authority, which was not enough to finish his tomb. It is a precise and almost unbearably revealing measure of exactly how far the pharaoh's power had fallen. In the age of Thutmose III, the state would have finished the tomb. Under Amenhotep III, the tomb would have been lavishly decorated, and the king's eternal destiny would have been secured in polychrome paint and gilded wood. Under Ramesses II, the project would have been one of dozens of royal building initiatives proceeding simultaneously across the country, staffed by workers who had never missed a grain payment in their lives. Under Ramesses XI, it was an empty corridor in a quarried hillside, with a planning grid on the walls and silence where the painting should have been. There is a temptation, when telling a story like this one, to arrive at the modern parallel with the confident stride of a professor who knows exactly where the lecture is going. To say, look, here is the late New Kingdom, and here is your civilization, and here are the matching symptoms, the institutional erosion, and the concentration of power in non-governmental entities, and the growing gap between elite consumption and the conditions of working people, and the administrative dysfunction and the unfinished projects. To say, this is what collapse looks like in its early stages, and you are living in it. I am not going to do that. Not because the parallels are not there. They are. Every student of history finds them, whether they are reading about the late Roman Republic, or the Songhai Empire, or the final decades of the Ming Dynasty, or the last years of the New Kingdom. The structural patterns of institutional decay are recognizable across cultures and centuries because human social organization, for all its variety, operates on certain basic logics that tend to fail in certain recurring ways. The parallels are real, but the temptation to map the ancient pattern onto the present with precision is itself a kind of historical error. The specifics matter. Context matters. A civilization that faces the structural stresses of institutional decay in one era may find resources of adaptation that were not available in another. The Egyptian state did not die with Ramesses XI. It continued for another 1,000 years, long enough to be conquered by Alexander the Great, and then become the breadbasket of Rome, and then persist as a Coptic Christian community into the Islamic period and beyond. The institutional continuities that survived the Third Intermediate Period were real continuities. The catastrophe was real, but it was not total, and part of what made it survivable was exactly the institutional depth that the New Kingdom had built over 5 centuries. The hieroglyphic writing system, the temple networks, the agricultural infrastructure of the Nile Valley, the accumulated technical knowledge of the craftsmen, and the priests, and the administrators, who continued to function even when the political superstructure above them was fragmented and weak. What the story of Ramesses XI does tell us, with precision and clarity, is something about the relationship between institutional health and civilizational resilience. The New Kingdom was as resilient a civilization as the ancient world produced. It survived the Hyksos invasion and the Amarna heresy and the Bronze Age collapse. It survived the assassination of its kings and the corruption of its administrators and the labor strikes of its workers. It survived a great deal. What it could not survive in the end was the sustained and incremental erosion of the mutual obligations that held its institutional fabric together, compounded over more than a century of weak leadership and institutional drift. until the fabric became too thin to hold. This is the lesson that is genuinely universal, genuinely applicable across historical contexts, genuinely worth taking seriously. Institutions are not self-maintaining. They require active investment. The trust that makes complex coordination possible does not accumulate automatically. It is built by the consistent fulfillment of obligations, by the reliable delivery of the grain that was promised, by the honoring of the service that was performed, by the enforcement of the rules that make it rational to cooperate, rather than defect. When that investment is withdrawn, when obligations begin to be dishonored in small and apparently manageable ways, the trust erodes. And the erosion, once begun, tends to accelerate. The incentive to defect from a system that is failing is stronger than the incentive to sustain it. The rational individual response to institutional decay is to extract what can be extracted before the system fails entirely. And the aggregate of individually rational extraction decisions is exactly what makes the system fail entirely. This is the trap that the late New Kingdom's institutions fell into. The officials who redirected resources to the Amun temple were not irrational. They were responding correctly to the reality that the Amun temple was the rising power and the pharaoh's government was the declining power. The provincial governors who stopped enforcing tribute collection were not irrational. They were managing their local relationships with the practical wisdom of people who understood that the threat of central enforcement was diminishing. The tomb robbers who broke into the royal necropolis were not irrational, though their actions seem to us like sacrilege of the most profound kind. They were responding to the reality that the guards were no longer reliably guarding, that the institutional commitment to the protection of the royal dead had been degraded enough to create opportunity. Each of these actors was responding to the system as they found it, not as it had been or as it was supposed to be. And the aggregate of their responses was the end of the New Kingdom. The high priest Herihor, writing his name in a cartouche and placing his image at the same scale as the pharaoh in the temple of Khonsu at Karnak, was not a revolutionary. He was a man who had looked at the system around him and seen what it had become, and had drawn the logical conclusion about where the real power resided. He was not wrong. The system had in fact shifted. The pharaoh's authority was in fact nominal. The conclusion he drew was the correct conclusion from the available evidence, but drawing it and acting on it openly was also the act that made it permanent. By placing his cartouche on the wall at Karnak, Herihor did not merely observe that the New Kingdom's power structure had changed. He helped ensure that it could not change back. This is the other lesson worth carrying. The stories we tell about power, about legitimacy, about who has the right to do what and why, are not just stories. They are institutional facts. The pharaoh's authority rested, in the final analysis, on the collective agreement to treat it as real. For 500 years, that agreement held. The rituals were performed. The titles were used. The images were painted on the temple walls in the correct proportions. The institutional performance of pharaonic authority reinforced the belief in pharaonic authority, which made the institutional performance possible, which reinforced the belief. It was a feedback loop that ran in the productive direction for a very long time. When the performance began to break down, when the titles were still used, but the power was elsewhere, when the temples were still built, but the man who commissioned them held a priestly title rather than a royal one, the feedback loop began to run in the opposite direction. The institutional performance of pharaonic authority became a performance without a performer, and once Herihor wrote his name in a cartouche, the performance was over. The belief that the authority was real required a single king performing it consistently. Once two names appeared in cartouches simultaneously, the magic was broken. The fiction of divine kingship that had organized Egyptian political life for 2.5 millennia had finally, under the accumulated weight of its own failures, become visible as a fiction. There is something both tragic and clarifying about that visibility. The New Kingdom, at its height, was capable of achievements that are still astonishing 3,000 years later. The temples at Karnak, expanded over 4 centuries by king after king, each adding a pylon or a court or a colonnade, constitute one of the largest religious complexes ever built, a physical accumulation of devotion and ambition and organizational capacity that has no real parallel in the ancient world outside of the comparable complex at Luxor. The tomb of Nefertari in the Valley of the Queens, with its painted walls still vivid after 3,000 years, is one of the greatest achievements of any decorative art program in human history. The Hittite peace treaty, the world's first recorded international diplomatic agreement, stands at the beginning of a tradition of diplomacy and international law that runs, however discontinuously, to the present day. The medical, mathematical, and astronomical knowledge preserved in the Egyptian papyri represents a genuine contribution to the human intellectual heritage. None of that was small. None of it was accidental. It was the product of exactly the institutional investment, the careful maintenance of mutual obligations, the sustained organizational commitment that the later 20th Dynasty failed to maintain. The New Kingdom built those things because, for most of its history, it was an institution that worked, that fulfilled its obligations, that delivered on its promises, that maintained the chains of trust, that allowed complex coordination toward large-scale goals. When the institution stopped working, the large-scale goals became unachievable, and the pharaoh's tomb was left with a planning grid on the walls. The world lost something real when the New Kingdom ended. Not just the political structure, not just the imperial power, but the specific institutional and creative capacity that the New Kingdom represented. The Third Intermediate Period continued many things. It did not continue everything. The tradition of great royal tomb painting, which had produced the extraordinary decorated chambers of the Valley of the Kings, effectively ended. The tradition of large-scale royal building programs, which had produced Karnak and Abu Simbel and Luxor and Abydos, contracted dramatically. The international diplomatic and commercial network that the New Kingdom had maintained and participated in was gone. Egypt continued. But the specific Egypt of the New Kingdom, the Egypt that had been the dominant power of the ancient world for 500 years, was finished. And the man on whose watch it ended was a pharaoh whose name we know from a few inscriptions and an unfinished tomb and the documents of other people. Ramesses XI, the last pharaoh of the New Kingdom, a man who may have been a victim of circumstances beyond any individual's control, or a man who lacked the political gifts that the moment required, or both. We do not know what kind of man he was. We know what kind of reign he had. And the reign tells us everything we need to know about what the New Kingdom had become by the time it ended. Come back with me one final time to the Valley of the Kings. It is early morning. The sun has not yet crested the ridge of rock above the valley, and the great bowl of limestone is still in shadow, the air cool in a way that will be gone by mid-morning. The tour groups have not arrived yet. The hawkers outside the entrance have not taken their positions. For a few minutes, in the early light of a morning in the Nile Valley, it is possible to stand in the Valley of the Kings and feel something close to the silence that filled it for 3,000 years. The tombs are numbered. KV1, KV2, all the way up into the 60s and beyond, a catalogue of excavations and discoveries, stretching from the earliest systematic clearances of the 19th century to the most recent work of the 21st. The numbering is roughly chronological, not in order of construction, but in order of discovery, which means the numbers are a record of the history of Egyptology as much as of ancient Egypt. KV1 is Ramesses VII, KV2 is Ramesses IV. The famous ones cluster in the middle of the valley and along the southern branch. KV62, Tutankhamun, undiscovered until 1922. KV17, Seti I, with its extraordinary painted ceilings. KV7, Ramesses VI, badly damaged by floodwater, stripped of nearly everything in antiquity. And KV4. KV4 sits in the main valley, not far from the entrance. It is not the most impressive tomb in the complex. It is not famous for painted walls or golden coffins. It is notable for what it does not have. The tomb cuts into the rock for a reasonable distance. 2 descending corridors and a transverse hall are roughly finished. The walls cut smooth but unpainted, the floor level but undecorated, and then it simply stops. The burial chamber that was supposed to be at the end of the sequence was never cut. The paintings were never applied. The quartzite sarcophagus that should have waited in the burial chamber was never placed there. We do not know where Ramesses XI was buried, or whether he was buried with any of the ritual care that pharaonic tradition required. or whether in the chaos of his final years, the ritual care was simply not available. The planning grid on the walls is the last word. The grid is a working document, the first stage of the decorative process, the scaffold on which the paintings would have been built. Finding a planning grid without the paintings is finding the intention without the execution, the promise without the fulfillment. It is the physical record of a moment when someone, a master draftsman, most likely a senior craftsman from Deir el-Medina, stood in this corridor with a stretched cord covered in red ochre and snapped the lines onto the fresh plaster, dividing the wall into the proportional grid that would have guided the painters in rendering the correct dimensions of the figures that were never rendered. The grid is careful and precise. The work was competent. The craftsman did his job, and then something stopped. What stopped it? The scholarly answers are careful and qualified. The disruption of the Deir el-Medina workforce in the final years of the 20th Dynasty, the redirection of administrative resources toward the competing power centers of Herihor and the Tanite kings, the simple fact that a dying dynasty had lost the institutional will to invest in the future of a pharaoh whose future was, in every practical sense, behind him. All of these things are probably true. None of them is the whole answer. The whole answer is what this documentary has been building toward. A civilization had lost, through a century of incremental institutional failure, the specific capacity to complete the specific act of finishing a king's tomb. Not because the stones were unavailable, not because the craftsmen were unskilled, not because the religious tradition that mandated the tomb's construction had ceased to be believed. All of these things were still present in the Egypt of Ramesses XI. What was absent was the organizational will, the institutional coherence, the chain of trust and obligation that would have translated the available stones and the available craftsmen and the continuing religious tradition into the completed act of building the tomb. It is the most eloquent monument in the Valley of the Kings. Not the most beautiful, not the most elaborate, not the most famous, but the most eloquent, because what it says, in the language of absence and incompletion, is exactly what the New Kingdom story amounts to in the end. Here is what I want you to carry away from this story. The New Kingdom of Egypt was, for 500 years, one of the most remarkable institutional achievements in human history. It organized millions of people across a complex and demanding landscape into a functioning civilization of extraordinary productive capacity. It built things that are still standing 3,000 years later. It developed administrative, diplomatic, and artistic traditions that influenced the ancient Mediterranean world and that continue to fascinate and inspire the modern world. It was not perfect. It was not just, by modern standards. It was built on slave labor and military conquest and the enforced submission of millions of people to the will of a divine king. But in the terms of its own time and its own possibilities, it was astonishing, and it ended. Not with a bang, not with an invasion, not with a plague or a catastrophe that anyone could point to as the definitive moment of collapse. It ended the way most things end, gradually, then suddenly. 100 small failures, each one manageable in isolation, each one a little harder to manage in the context of all the others. A century of weak pharaohs, a growing deficit of institutional trust, a priesthood that expanded its authority because no one with the power to restrain it chose to do so. A tomb robbery crisis that the judicial system was too compromised to fully resolve. A labor strike that the administrative system was too degraded to prevent. And finally, a pharaoh sitting in his palace in the north, while a general priest sat in his palace in the south, and the planning grid gathered dust on the walls of an unfinished tomb. What makes this story worth telling is not the spectacle of collapse. Civilizations have always fallen, and there is nothing inherently instructive in the fall. What makes it worth telling is what it reveals about the mechanisms of resilience and the mechanisms of failure, about the specific things that make complex institutions capable of great achievements and the specific ways those things erode. The tomb is not a monument to failure. It is a monument to something more complicated and more human than failure. It is a monument to the distance between intention and execution, between the grid on the wall and the paintings that were supposed to fill it. between the civilization that the New Kingdom had been and the civilization it had become by the time Ramesses XI needed his tomb to be finished. It is a monument to the gap between what was promised and what was delivered, a gap that opened slowly and widened year by year and generation by generation, until it was wide enough to swallow a dynasty. The craftsman who snapped the planning grid onto those walls was doing his job correctly. He was preparing the surface for the painters who would come after him. He did not know, presumably, that the painters were not coming. He did not know that the grid would be the last mark made on those walls. He did not know that 3,000 years later, archaeologists and tourists would stand in the corridor looking at his careful red lines and trying to understand what they meant. He did the work that was in front of him and moved on, and then history moved in a direction that made his careful preparation irrelevant. That is not a story about failure. It is a story about the gap between individual competence and systemic capacity, between the work that individuals do correctly and the larger systems that either use that work or do not. The craftsman was not the New Kingdom. He was a skilled man doing his job in a civilization that was no longer capable of completing the job he was preparing the way for. And that incapacity, that gap between individual skill and systemic will, is the signature of the New Kingdom's end. Ramesses XI ruled Egypt for approximately 30 years, give or take the uncertainties of ancient chronology. He left almost no record of personal achievement. His name appears on a handful of inscriptions. His tomb is unfinished. His burial place is unknown. By every conventional measure of pharaonic success, his reign was a failure. The New Kingdom ended on his watch. The most powerful and productive civilization of the ancient world entered its long twilight during the decades when he held the double crown. And yet, he was the last pharaoh of the New Kingdom. And the New Kingdom, even in decline, even with its institutional fabric fraying and its administrative capacity diminished and its international empire a memory, was still Egypt. The Nile still flooded, the temples still stood, the craftsmen still knew how to cut stone and mix paint and write hieroglyphics and perform the ancient rituals. The accumulated knowledge and tradition of 500 years of extraordinary civilization was still present in the landscape and in the people who inhabited it. It would survive the Third Intermediate Period and the Kushite reunification and the Assyrian invasion and the Persian conquest and the Macedonian conquest and the Roman annexation. It would survive in some form for another 3,000 years. The New Kingdom was the high point, the peak of the curve, the moment when everything that Egyptian civilization had been building toward for 1,500 years came together in its fullest expression. And like all peaks, it was followed by descent. That is not a tragedy. That is the shape of things. The tragedy, if we must use the word, is the gap between what was and what might have been, the unfinished paintings, the undelivered grain, the unremedied injustices, the institutional failures that were seen clearly enough by enough people with enough information that they could have been addressed and were not addressed until the moment for addressing them had passed. That is the story of Ramesses XI, not a story of external catastrophe, not a story of inevitable decline, a story of the slow, incremental failure of the institutional commitments that hold complex civilizations together, played out over a century, culminating in a pharaoh whose tomb was left with a grid on the walls. Stand in the Valley of the Kings in the early morning, find KV4, look at the entrance cut into the rock, go in as far as you are permitted, look at the walls, look at the careful red lines of the planning grid. Think about the craftsmen who put them there and the civilization that failed to build on them. This is what the end of the New Kingdom looks like. Not fire, not flood, not the clash of armies, just a corridor in a hillside, cut and smoothed and gridded and then left, in the silence of an unfinished intention, for 3,000 years. We are still listening.